There is a specific sound a mechanical watch makes when the mainspring is wound too tight. It is a microscopic protest, a tiny metallic scream right before the tension snaps the gear. I've listened to that sound for 50 years. My name is Isaiah Vance. I'm 72 years old and I rebuild timepieces in the South Loop of Chicago. My shop does not look like much from the street. The brick is faded by decades of harsh winters, and the lettering on the glass has chipped away at the edges. But inside, the air smells of brass polish and specialized oil and the quiet patience required to bring dead things back to life. My grandson Jamal likes the smell. He is 10 years old, with eyes that see entirely too much for his age. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he walks from his middle school, drops his backpack near the old oak display case, and finishes his math homework while I work. We do not speak much. He likes the ticking. He says it helps him think. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, the kind of day where the Chicago wind cuts right through your coat when the bell above the door rang. Marcus walked in. Marcus is my son. He is 42 years old, wears suits that cost more than my first car, and moves with the aggressive energy of a man who believes he owns every room he enters. He works in corporate liquidations, tearing apart failing companies and selling off the pieces. He stepped into the shop, bringing a gust of freezing air with him, and immediately checked his luxury watch. Jamal looked up from his worksheet, his pencil pausing, but he did not smile. Marcus gave the boy a brief, distracted pat on the head, a gesture meant for an audience, not for Jamal. Then Marcus turned to me. "You are still working on that old junk, Isaiah," he said. His voice was smooth, polished, hiding the edge underneath. I did not look up from my magnifying loupe. I was setting a ruby jewel into a balance bridge, a task that required absolute stillness. "It is not junk, Marcus," I replied carefully, placing the stone. "It is a classic piece and it requires respect." Marcus let out a short, dismissive laugh. He began to pace around the small shop. His expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the worn wooden floor. I watched him from the corner of my eye. When a person appreciates horology, they lean in to look at the watches. They admire the craftsmanship, the impossible, tiny gears, the dedication of the maker. Marcus did not look at the watches. His eyes swept across the room in a cold, calculating grid. He looked at the antique tools, the vintage display cases, the heavy iron safe in the back. He was not looking at history, he was taking an inventory. He was running numbers in his head. "You cannot keep doing this forever," he said, stopping in front of my main workbench. "The neighborhood is changing. Property values are skyrocketing here in the South Loop. You are sitting on a gold mine and you are wasting it fixing broken clocks for pennies." "I'm perfectly comfortable," I said, setting my tools down slowly. "Comfortable is for people who have given up," Marcus said, leaning against the counter, invading my workspace. "You are getting older. Your hands are not what they used to be. It is time to start thinking about the future, about succession. You need to let me take over the administrative side, handle the property, modernize the assets. You can just sit at home and rest." He framed it as a favor. He framed it as concern. But I heard the mainspring winding too tight. I heard the tiny metallic scream. He did not want to modernize my shop. He wanted to liquidate it. He wanted to strip the copper wire, sell the bricks, and leave nothing behind but a bank deposit. I looked at Jamal. The boy had stopped pretending to do math. He was watching his father with a dark, serious expression. Jamal knew. Even at 10 years old, he recognized the coldness in the room. "I appreciate your concern, Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level, "but I am not ready to close my doors just yet." Marcus narrowed his eyes. The pleasant corporate mask slipped just for a fraction of a second, revealing the pure, unadulterated greed underneath. He checked his luxury watch one more time, a deliberate, insulting gesture, reminding me that his time was worth vastly more than mine. "Think about it, Isaiah," he said, his tone dropping an octave, turning the suggestion into a quiet threat. "I will have some papers drawn up. Just to review. We will talk soon." He buttoned his expensive cashmere coat and walked out of the shop. The door swung shut, the bell chiming a hollow note. The freezing wind rattled the glass. In the sudden quiet, the ticking of 100 watches seemed deafening. Jamal looked at me, his pencil gripped tightly in his small hand. "He's going to try to take it, Grandpa," the boy said softly. I looked at the door where my son had just stood. I did not feel shock, and I did not feel grief. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. "I know, Jamal," I said, picking up my tools again, my hands completely, perfectly steady. "But a watch only breaks if you let them turn the crown." Kendra began her visits the very next week. My daughter-in-law has always been a careful woman. She moves through the world like someone constantly adjusting a delicate mechanism, ensuring every piece serves a specific purpose. For 14 years, we maintained a polite distance. She remembered my birthday with an expensive card, and I bought her nice wine for Christmas. We did not pretend to be close. So when she started appearing at the shop on Tuesday mornings holding a paper cup of herbal tea, I noticed the shift in the gears. She brought chamomile, she said, because the winter air was harsh and I needed to stay warm. She stood near the display cases, her expensive coat perfectly buttoned, smiling a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She asked about my joints, about how I was sleeping, about whether the intricate work was getting too hard for my eyes. Her voice was soothing, perfectly modulated, the kind of voice you use when you want someone to lower their defenses. I took the tea. I thanked her, and I held the warm cup in my hands. I did not drink it. It had a scent beneath the chamomile, a sharp medicinal note barely there. I have spent my life working with chemical solvents, cleaning solutions, and specialized oils. My nose knows when something does not belong. When she left, I poured the tea into a glass jar, sealed it, and placed it in the back of my safe. She came back 3 days later. This time she brought a proper thermos, pouring the tea into my own ceramic mug. She stayed longer, chatting about Marcus, about his stressful job, about how much they both worried about my well-being, living all alone. "It is just about keeping you safe, Isaiah," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the mug. I waited until she turned her back to look at a grandfather clock, and I emptied the cup into the soil of a dying fern by the window. The slip happened on her 4th visit. It was snowing heavily, and she was in a hurry to get to a charity luncheon. She took off her gloves, set them on the edge of my workbench, poured the tea, asked her usual questions, and left in a rush. She took her gloves, but she left her purse slightly open. A small brown glass vial had tumbled out, rolling silently onto the soft leather pad where I rest my tools. I picked it up. There was no label, just a simple dropper cap and a clear liquid inside. I did not feel shock. I felt the cold, precise focus of a man examining a shattered balance wheel. I closed the shop early that afternoon. I took the vial and the jar of saved tea to a private analytical laboratory in the West Loop. I paid in cash. I did not give my real name. The technician told me it would take 3 days. I went back to my shop, sat in the quiet, and listened to the ticking. I thought about my son and the woman he married and the slow, deliberate poison they were trying to feed me. The results came back on a Friday. The report was 4 pages of dense chemical analysis. The summary was simple. The substance was a synthetic compound designed to mimic the rapid onset of dementia. Confusion, memory loss, disorientation. If ingested regularly over several months, it would create a flawless, undeniable medical record of a man losing his mind, a man who desperately needed a conservatorship, a man who needed his son to take control of everything. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my breast pocket. Most men, upon discovering their own flesh and blood was slowly poisoning, their mind would rage. They would call the police. They would scream. I did not. If I confronted them now, they would simply deny it, hire expensive lawyers, and find another, faster way to remove me. You do not stop a faulty gear by smashing it with a hammer. You let it spin until you understand exactly how it connects to the rest of the machine. If they wanted a man losing his mind, I decided to give them one. The performance began the following Tuesday. Marcus came to the shop, checking his watch as usual. I was at my bench, working on a simple pocket watch. I deliberately set my tweezers down, looked around the empty counter, and frowned. Where did I put the mainspring? I muttered loud enough for him to hear. Marcus paused, watching me. I opened 3 different drawers, my hands intentionally clumsy. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the floor, projecting a mild, helpless confusion. It is right in front of you, Dad, Marcus said, his voice slow, careful. I blinked, looking down at the bench. I let a look of profound relief wash over my face, followed instantly by embarrassment. Ah, I said, rubbing my temples. My eyes are playing tricks on me today. Too many small parts, I suppose. Marcus did not smile, but a deep, calculating satisfaction settled into his posture. He saw exactly what he had paid to see. Over the next few weeks, I refined the act. I called Jamal by Marcus's name once. I forgot to lock the front door while Kendra was visiting, acting startled when she pointed it out. I let my sentences trail off, losing the thread of the conversation, staring blankly out the frosted window. Every time I slipped, I saw the triumphant gleam in their eyes. They thought they were breaking me down. They thought the poison was working. They thought I was a crumbling foundation ready to be swept away. They had no idea they were walking into a trap built with the patience of a man who knows exactly how to keep time. I waited exactly 3 weeks. A watchmaker knows that patience is not just waiting. It is waiting for the exact right moment to apply pressure. I needed someone who understood pressure. I closed the shop early on a Thursday, walking 4 blocks in the freezing sleet to a payphone outside a shuttered grocery store. I did not use my cell phone. I did not use the shop line. When you are dealing with a corporate liquidator, you assume they have eyes on the ledger. I dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. Tyrone Washington answered with his last name, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. Tyrone is 50 years old, built like a freight train, and possesses a mind as sharp as a diamond cutter. He spent 20 years at the Treasury Department tracking ghost money through the darkest corners of the global banking system. He left federal service 5 years ago after his superiors told him to stop looking too closely at a corrupt politician. Tyrone did not stop looking. He just changed his employer. Now he works for himself. He is also the son of Elijah Washington. Elijah was my mentor. He taught me the trade back in the 70s when we were the only 2 black horologists on the South Side. When Elijah passed away, I promised I would always look out for his boy. It turned out his boy grew up to be the kind of man who looks out for everybody else. Tyrone, I said, leaning into the metal hood of the payphone to block the wind. It is Isaiah. The line was quiet for a second. Uncle Isaiah, Tyrone said, his voice warming instantly. It has been a minute. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said, but I have a mechanism that is out of alignment, and I need someone to trace the fault line. Tyrone knew my language. He knew I was not talking about a Rolex. What kind of fault line, he asked. The corporate kind, I replied. My son Marcus. He's circling the shop, and he brought his wife to help. They are trying to build a medical file on me. I need to know why they are in such a hurry to liquidate a 72-year-old man. There was a long pause. When Tyrone spoke again, the warmth was gone, replaced by the icy efficiency of a federal investigator. "Give me 48 hours, he said. I will pull the thread." I hung up, walking back to the shop with a lighter step. Marcus thought he was the smartest man in Chicago. He thought his expensive suits and his corner office made him untouchable. But Marcus only knew how to read a balance sheet. Tyrone knew how to read the hidden ink between the lines. 2 days later, Tyrone walked into my shop. He wore a dark wool peacoat, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. The bell chimed. Jamal was sitting in his usual corner working on a history essay. Tyrone looked at the boy, offering a slow, respectful nod. Jamal nodded back, his eyes widening slightly at Tyrone and his sheer size. Tyrone walked over to my bench. He did not ask how I was doing. He set a thick, unmarked manila envelope on the counter directly over a disassembled pocket watch. "Your boy has a beautiful resume," Tyrone said, his voice low enough that Jamal could not hear the specifics. "Top-tier firm luxury penthouse country club memberships. From the outside, he is untouchable. He is a king." I wiped my hands on a cloth, looking at the envelope. "But the inside is rotten," I said. Tyrone tapped the thick paper. "Uncle Isaiah, the inside is not just rotten. It is burning to the ground." He opened the flap, sliding out a stack of financial documents. They were not standard credit reports. These were deep forensic wire traces, the kind of things you only find if you know exactly which federal databases to cross-reference. "Marcus is severely over-leveraged," Tyrone explained, pointing a thick finger at a column of red numbers. "He tried to start his own private equity fund 18 months ago. He bet heavy on commercial real estate right before the market completely fractured. He owes millions, and not just to the banks. He borrowed from private lenders. The kind of lenders who do not send collection letters, the kind who send people to your house." I stared at the numbers. The zeros stretched across the page, a terrifying testament to my son and his arrogant greed. He was drowning, and he was trying to use me as a raft. He needed cash, massive amounts of it, to keep the wolves away from his penthouse door. I looked up from the ledger, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. "So he needs my shop," I said. "He needs the property to sell to cover his debts." Tyrone shook his head slowly. He did not look at me with pity. He looked at me with the grim focus of an investigator about to deliver the fatal blow. "He does not need to sell it." "Uncle Isaiah," Tyrone said, pulling a second file from the envelope. "He already bled it." Tyrone slid a thick stack of legal paper across the glass counter. It had a blue stamp on the top corner. Cook County Recorder of Deeds. I recognized the format immediately. It was a commercial property lien, a mortgage document. I looked at the address. It was my address. My shop. "Look at the date," Tyrone said quietly. I traced my finger down the page. The filing was dated 6 months ago. Right around the time Marcus first started asking about my retirement. Right around the time he started complaining about the neighborhood changing. The principal amount I read aloud, my voice feeling strangely detached from my body. $450,000. Against the building, Tyrone confirmed. And the inventory. Your vintage pieces, your tools, your safe. He used the entire business as collateral for a high-interest commercial loan. He took the cash, funneled it through a shell company, and dumped it directly into his failing equity fund. I flipped to the signature page. There at the bottom was my name. Isaiah Vance. The ink was black. The loops were correct. The slant was nearly perfect. But a watchmaker knows when a part is a replica. The pressure was wrong. The hesitation at the end of the V was a clear tell. Someone had practiced this signature hundreds of times until they felt confident enough to sit in front of a notary. "That is not my hand," I said. "I know it is not," Tyrone said, crossing his arms over his massive chest. I pulled the notary file. The notary is a man named Desmond Hayes. He is a lawyer, the kind who operates out of a strip mall and specializes in making paperwork disappear. Marcus paid him well to look the other way while someone else held the pen. I stood there in the quiet of the shop. The ticking of the clocks surrounded me, steady and indifferent. For 40 years I had built this business. I had worked through sickness, through grief, through the agonizing pain in my joints just to keep the doors open. I had built a sanctuary, and my own flesh and blood had quietly mortgaged it out from under me, trading my legacy to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be rich. "If he defaults on this loan," I said, looking at Tyrone. "The bank seizes the building," Tyrone answered bluntly. "You lose the shop. You lose everything inside it." And given the state of his corporate accounts, he is going to miss his first major balloon payment in exactly 3 weeks. "He forged my name on a federal bank document," I said, the reality solidifying into a cold, hard fact. "Yes, he did," Tyrone said. "And that is mortgage fraud. That is a federal offense. If we take this to the authorities right now, he's looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary." I looked at the forged signature again. A father expects many things from his son. Rebellion, misunderstanding, distance. But you never truly expect to see your own name used as the weapon that destroys you. I folded the document. "We are not taking it to the authorities yet," I said. Tyrone raised an eyebrow. "Uncle Isaiah, this is the smoking gun. We have him. If we strike now," I said, placing the document back into the envelope, "he will claim it was a misunderstanding. He will claim I gave verbal consent and forgot about it because my mind is slipping. Kendra is already building the medical file to prove I'm senile. They have prepared for this exact moment." Tyrone leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the counter. "So what is the play?" "We let them think they are winning," I said. "We let them walk right into the trap they built for me. I need to know everything, Tyrone. I need to know every single thing he has touched. Because if he was desperate enough to forge a federal loan against his own father, there is no line he will not cross." Tyrone looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached into the envelope one last time. His expression darkened, the professional detachment slipping away, leaving something that looked a lot like genuine anger. "You are right, Uncle Isaiah," Tyrone said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "There is no line he will not cross, because the shop is not the only thing he stole from." He set a final thin folder on the glass. This one did not have a county stamp. This one had the logo of a prominent Chicago wealth management firm. I looked at the folder. I looked at Tyrone. "What is this?" I asked. Tyrone took a deep breath. "It is Jamal," he said. I looked at the folder with the wealth management logo, and a profound, terrible silence filled my shop. The ticking of the clocks seemed to stop, or perhaps the blood rushing in my ears simply drowned them out. I had set up an irrevocable trust for Jamal 5 years ago. It was the absolute, undeniable guarantee of his future. I had funded it with $200,000, the sum total of an inheritance from my late wife and a decade of careful saving. It was designed to be untouchable even by me. It was locked away, meant to pay for his college, for his first home, for a life free from the crushing weight of debt. I opened the thin folder, my hands feeling suddenly intensely cold. Tyrone did not speak, he just let me read the ledgers. The first page showed the initial balance, sitting peacefully accumulating modest interest. The second page showed the beginning of the end. 14 months ago, a withdrawal of $20,000 marked as an emergency educational expense. 6 weeks later, another $30,000 marked as medical necessity. The withdrawals continued, a methodical, quiet bleeding of my grandson and his future. They were calculated amounts just under the threshold that might trigger an automatic high-level fraud alert at the institution. The current balance at the bottom of the last page was less than $12,000. He took it all I said, the words barely making it past the tightness in my throat. He took his own son and his future to pay for his tailored suits and his empty penthouse. He submitted a forged guardian authorization. Tyrone explained, his voice low and tight, with his own suppressed rage. Since he is the biological father, the bank did not look too closely at the first request. After that, he set up an automated transfer protocol using Desmond Hayes, that crooked strip mall lawyer, to rubber stamp the legal justifications. The bank thought they were releasing funds to keep the boy in private school or to pay for specialized health care. Instead, the money was wired directly into Marcus and his failing private equity shell accounts. I turned my head slowly, looking past Tyrone and his massive shoulders toward the corner of the shop. Jamal was still sitting there, chewing on the end of his pencil, staring intently at a math problem. His small gray sweater was frayed at the left cuff. I had offered to buy him a new one last month, but he had shaken his head, saying he liked this one because it was soft. He was 10 years old. He did not ask for much, he did not complain, and he sat in my shop for hours just to be near someone who paid attention to him. His own father stole from him. I whispered, the reality burning like acid in my chest. To steal from me is one thing, Tyrone. I am old. I have lived my life and I can fight back. But to steal from the boy, to take the foundation I built for him and burn it to keep himself warm. It is the act of a desperate, broken man, Tyrone said softly. When the corporate debt started calling, Marcus panicked. He saw that trust fund sitting there growing quietly, and he treated it like his own personal emergency reserve. He probably told himself he would pay it back once his big real estate gamble paid off. They always tell themselves that right before they lose everything. He is not going to pay it back, I said, my voice hardening into something cold and sharp and final. He's going to try to take the shop to cover the rest of his bleeding, and then he is going to discard us both. Tyrone nodded slowly, gathering the papers and sliding them back into the thick envelope. You wanted to know the depth of the rot, Uncle Isaiah. Now you know. He has committed federal wire fraud, federal mortgage fraud, and grand larceny against a minor. If we hand this file to the United States Attorney tomorrow morning, Marcus will not see the outside of a cell until Jamal is 30 years old. I looked at the boy again. Jamal looked up, catching my eye, and gave me a small, hesitant smile. I nodded back, forcing the warmth into my expression, hiding the absolute devastation tearing through me. We do not go to the authorities tomorrow, I said, turning back to Tyrone. Tyrone frowned, his thick brow furrowing. Uncle Isaiah, I know he is your blood. But there is no saving a man who does this to his own child. You cannot protect him from this. I am not protecting him, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, precise whisper. I am building a trap that he can never, ever escape. If we go to the authorities now with just the paperwork, he will drag this out in court for years. He will use whatever money he has left to hire defense attorneys to claim I authorized the loans, to claim the trust fund. Withdrawals were legitimate parental expenses. He will muddy the waters. I will not allow him to muddy the waters, Tyrone. I want him caught in the act. I want him completely, undeniably exposed in a way that no lawyer can ever undo. Tyrone looked at me, a slow, grim understanding dawning in his eyes. He leaned against the glass display case, crossing his arms. What is the next move, then? He forged the mortgage and he drained the trust, I said, tracking the logic like a complex gear train. But he still needs my signature to sell the shop and liquidate the business assets completely. He needs a power of attorney or a conservatorship. That is why Kendra is bringing the poison tea. They are accelerating their timeline. They are getting desperate. Tyrone tapped his fingers against his bicep. Desperate people make mistakes, he said. We are going to help them make a massive one, I replied. We are going to let them bring their corrupt lawyer into my home. We are going to let them think my mind is finally gone. We are going to let them put the pen in my hand." Tyrone smiled a sharp, dangerous expression. "And I will be right there watching the whole thing go down." I reached under my workbench, pulling out the small glass vial Kendra had left behind. I handed it to Tyrone. "Take this to your contacts," I said. "Get a certified chain of custody on the chemical analysis. I want her tied to this just as tightly as he is tied to the fraud. They are a team, and they will fall together." Tyrone slipped the vial into his heavy coat pocket. "Consider it done," he said. He looked over at Jamal one last time, his expression softening before looking back at me. "We are going to get it all back, Uncle Isaiah. Every single cent." "I know we are," I said, "because I am the one keeping the time." Tyrone turned and walked out of the shop, the winter wind howling as he opened the door. I sat back down at my bench, picked up my tweezers, and went back to work. I had a masterpiece to restore and a son to destroy. The escalation came on a Tuesday evening, right as the Chicago winter deepened into a bitter freeze. I was sitting in my living room, the television playing a documentary on low volume, a blanket pulled over my knees. The front door unlocked. Marcus walked in, brushing snow from his cashmere lapels, and he was not alone. The man behind him wore a suit that was too sharp, too deliberate, the kind of suit a man wears when he wants to distract you from his eyes. Marcus introduced him as Desmond Hayes, a family advisor, a specialist in estate planning. I recognized the name immediately from the bottom of the forged mortgage document Tyrone had shown me. Desmond smiled a slick, practiced expression and offered his hand. I looked at it for a long moment, letting my eyes drift to the television, before slowly, shakily reaching out to take it. "Nice to meet you, David," I said deliberately, getting his name wrong. Desmond did not correct me. He just looked at Marcus. A silent communication passing between them, a confirmation that I was exactly as far gone as Marcus had promised. They sat on the sofa opposite my armchair. Desmond opened a slim leather briefcase, pulling out a stack of heavy paper, the edges crisp and dangerous. He placed a silver pen on the coffee table, aligning it perfectly with the documents. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dripping with that artificial, suffocating concern. "Dad." Marcus said Desmond is here to help us streamline things. You have been so tired lately, forgetting your keys, losing your tools at the shop. We just want to take the burden off your shoulders. I let my hands tremble slightly on my lap. "What kind of burden?" I asked, my voice thin, carrying a manufactured frailty. "Just the administrative headaches," Isaiah Desmond said, his tone smooth and unctuous. "This is a standard power of attorney. It simply allows Marcus to handle the banking, to pay the property taxes on the shop, to make sure you are taken care of. It is temporary, just until you feel more like yourself again." I stared at the papers. I knew exactly what those pages contained. They contained my financial execution. With that signature, Marcus would not need to forge anything else. He could legally sell the shop, liquidate the inventory, and walk away clean. I reached for the pen, letting my fingers hover over the silver barrel, my hand shaking just enough to look entirely convincing. I looked up at Marcus. "Are you sure this is necessary?" I asked, widening my eyes, projecting a deep, pathetic uncertainty. Marcus placed his hand over mine, completely missing the irony of the gesture. "It is for the best," Daddy promised, looking me right in the eye. "I am your son, and I will always protect you." I held his gaze for 3 seconds, memorizing the absolute lack of soul in his pupils. Then I picked up the pen. I brought it to the paper, hovering over the signature line. Marcus stopped breathing. Desmond leaned in, his eyes locked on the tip of the pen like a vulture watching a dying animal. I pressed the ink to the page, making a small mark, and then I gasped, dropping the pen onto the floor. My heart. I wheezed, clutching my chest, letting my head loll back against the armchair. It is fluttering again, the room is spinning. Marcus jumped up, then his face a mask of sudden, frantic panic. Not for my health, but for the unsigned document sitting on the table. He grabbed the pen, trying to press it back into my hand. "Dad, just sign it quickly," he urged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Just sign it, and I will call the doctor." I squeezed my eyes shut, waving him away with a weak, trembling hand. "Not right now," I whispered, sounding completely exhausted. "I need to rest. I need my bed. Everything is too blurry." Desmond shot Marcus a furious warning look, silently telling him to back off before they ruined the entire setup. Marcus swallowed hard, staring at the blank signature line with pure naked hunger before finally backing away. They left the house 10 minutes later, their frustration thick enough to choke on, promising to return when I was feeling stronger. When the front door finally clicked shut, I opened my eyes. I stopped trembling. I picked up the silver pen from the floor, turned it over in my steady hands, and placed it neatly in the trash can. The helpless prey had survived another day, and the predators were growing reckless. Recklessness always breeds paranoia. When you are building a house out of lies, you start to wonder if the person holding the other side of the wall is going to let go. 2 days after the failed signing, I took my customary afternoon nap in the bedroom. I was not asleep. I was listening. The floorboards in my hallway have a specific language groaning in a very particular sequence depending on where you step. I heard the sequence. Someone was in the living room. It was not Jamal because Jamal was at school. It was not Kendra because Kendra walked with a heavy, deliberate heel. It was Marcus. I lay perfectly still, listening as he moved quietly through the front room, the sound of a decorative vase shifting on the bookshelf, the faint click of plastic against wood. 10 minutes later, I heard the front door close. I called Tyrone from the payphone an hour later. He arrived at the house through the back alley, slipping in through the kitchen door like a ghost. He did not say a word. He just walked straight into the living room, his eyes scanning the space with the cold, mechanical precision of a federal sweep. It took him exactly 4 minutes. He reached up beneath the bottom shelf of the wooden bookcase, the one holding my late wife and her collection of vintage jazz records, and pulled his hand back. Sitting in his massive palm was a small black rectangle no larger than a matchbox. A voice-activated audio bug. Tyrone said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Consumer grade, but highly sensitive. It picks up a whisper from 30 feet away. I looked at the small black box. "He's bugging his own father," I said, the reality feeling almost too absurd to process. Tyrone shook his head, turning the device over. "No, Uncle Isaiah. He is not bugging you. He already thinks your brain is turning to mush. You do not bug a senile old man. You bug the other people talking to the senile old man." I let that sink in. "Kendra," I said. "Exactly." Tyrone confirmed, his eyes narrowing. The walls are closing in on his corporate empire. He knows Kendra is accelerating her own timeline with the poison tea. They are starting to turn on each other, maneuvering for the best position when the money finally drops. Marcus wants to know exactly what his wife is planning behind his back, and he wants it on tape. Illinois is a two-party consent state, I noted, pulling a fact from a lifetime of careful reading. Recording someone without their knowledge is a felony. Tyrone smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that transformed his entire face. "Yes, it is," he agreed. "And your boy just handed us the rope to hang him with." Tyrone walked into my kitchen, rummaging through the junk drawer next to the refrigerator. He pulled out an old black plastic kitchen timer, roughly the same size and shape as the recording device. He walked back into the living room, reached under the bookshelf, and stuck the kitchen timer exactly where the bug used to be. Then he slipped the actual recording device into a specialized signal blocking pouch in his jacket. "We keep the original," Tyrone said, patting his chest. "We pull the audio files. Whatever he captures of Kendra becomes our evidence. Whatever he captures of himself becomes his confession. Let them spy on each other, Uncle Isaiah. We are going to listen to every single word. The paranoia was a cancer, and it was eating them from the inside out. But I knew with absolute certainty that Kendra was not the kind of woman to simply wait for her husband to outmaneuver her. If Marcus was getting desperate, Kendra was getting dangerous. The poison tea was too slow, the legal paperwork was failing, and the debts were calling. I knew she was going to make a drastic move. I just did not know she was going to try to kill me on a Thursday. It happened on a Thursday morning just after 8 in the morning. The sky over Chicago was the color of old lead, and the wind was blowing straight off the lake. I've walked the exact same route to my shop for 40 years. 3 blocks down Wabash, taking the small alleyway behind the old textile building. I am a creature of habit. Kendra knew that. She had listened to Marcus complain about my rigid routines for 14 years. I was wearing my heavy wool coat, my breath pluming in the freezing air. I was thinking about the balance wheel of a 1940 Patek Philippe. I was not thinking about murder. The alleyway is narrow brick walls on both sides, barely wide enough for a delivery truck. I stepped into the shadow of the buildings. That was when I heard the engine. It was not the low, steady idle of a delivery van. It was the high, sudden scream of an engine being pushed to its absolute limit from a dead stop. I turned my head. A dark gray sedan plates, covered by a layer of winter slush, was tearing down the alley directly at me. There was no horn. There was no screech of brakes. The driver was accelerating. At 72 years old, your body does not move with the speed of your mind. I saw the grille of the car. I saw the impossible speed, but my legs felt rooted to the frozen asphalt. Then a force like a freight train hit me from the side. It was Tyrone. He had been walking 30 yards behind me, shadowing my morning commute ever since we found the bug in my living room. He hit me in the shoulder, tackling me hard into the deep recess of a loading dock door. We hit the concrete, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. A fraction of a second later, the gray sedan flew past us. The side mirror clipped the brick wall, shattering into pieces inches from where I had just been standing. The car did not slow down. It blew through the alley exit, fishtailed wildly onto the main street, and disappeared into the morning traffic. I lay on the freezing concrete, gasping for breath, my chest burning. Tyrone was already on his feet, brushing brick dust from his heavy coat. He did not look panicked. He held his cell phone in his hand, his thumb typing rapidly. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice completely calm. "No." I wheezed, sitting up slowly. "Just bruised." "You move fast, Tyrone." "I was already watching him," Tyrone said, offering a massive hand to pull me up. He had been idling in a loading zone for 20 minutes. Engine running, lights off. You do not sit in a freezing car with the engine running unless you are waiting to do something terrible. "Did you get the plate?" I asked, dusting off my coat. I got the plate, the make, the model, and a clear look at his face through the windshield. Tyrone said, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. "Give me until tonight, Uncle Isaiah. Go to the shop, lock the door, and do not let anyone in." I went to the shop. I locked the door. I sat at my workbench, my hands trembling for the first time in 50 years. It was not the fear of the car. It was the terrifying reality of what my family had become. My daughter-in-law had just tried to kill me on a Tuesday morning in the cold light of day. Tyrone came to the shop at 9 that night. The wind was howling outside, rattling the heavy security gates. He walked in carrying 2 cups of black coffee and a thin manila folder. He set the coffee on my bench. "His name is Darnell Vance," Tyrone said, taking a sip of his coffee. "No relation. He's a low-level runner, mostly petty theft and debt collection. He hangs around a bar on the west side. I found his gray sedan parked out back, missing the passenger side mirror." "Did you talk to him?" I asked. Tyrone gave a dark, humorless chuckle. We had a very productive conversation in the alley behind the bar. Darnell is not a hardened killer. He is just a broke kid who took a brown paper bag full of cash from a wealthy woman in a designer coat. Kendra, I said. Kendra, Tyrone confirmed. She paid him $10,000. $5,000 up front, $5,000 when it was on the evening news. She gave him your route, your schedule, and told him exactly which alley to use. What did you do with him? I asked, leaning forward over my tools. I explained his options. Tyrone said, his voice dropping to that terrifying Federal Register. I told him I had him on video accelerating into a pedestrian. I told him that was attempted murder in the first degree. I told him he was looking at 25 years in a maximum security block. And then I asked. And then I told him the other option, Tyrone said, sliding the folder across the glass display case. I told him he could become a cooperating witness for a federal investigation. I told him he could sign a sworn statement detailing exactly who hired him, where they met, and how much she paid. I opened the folder. Inside was a handwritten statement 3 pages long, detailing the entire murder plot. At the bottom was a shaky, terrified signature. Darnell had flipped. We have her, Tyrone said softly. She tried to play a dangerous game, and she handed us the ultimate weapon. We have the wire fraud on Marcus, we have the forged mortgage, we have the stolen trust fund, and now we have conspiracy to commit murder on Kendra. I closed the folder, staring at the crisp white paper. The puzzle was complete. Every gear was in place, every spring wound to its maximum tension. There was nothing left to investigate. There was only the execution. Call your contacts at the Treasury Department. Tyrone, I said, looking up at him, my voice colder than the winter wind outside. Call the FBI. It is time to set the final trap. The meeting took place the following Monday. We did not go to the towering federal building downtown. When you are bringing down a corporate liquidator with high-level connections, you do not walk through the front door where a security guard might tip off a friend. Tyrone arranged to sit down at a private, unmarked office suite in the South Loop, just 10 blocks from my shop. I wore my best suit, the dark gray wool tailored 30 years ago, but still sharp. I carried the heavy leather briefcase myself. Tyrone walked beside me, his presence alone clearing a path on the crowded sidewalk. Inside the suite, a single long wooden table sat in the middle of a sparse room. 3 men were waiting. 2 wore standard, unremarkable suits. The 3rd man sat at the head of the table. He had iron gray hair and eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime sorting through lies. Tyrone introduced him simply as Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. Agent Miller did not smile. He did not offer coffee. He looked at Tyrone and then he looked at me. Tyrone says you have a package for us, Mr. Vance. Miller said, his voice flat and professional. He says it is fully wrapped. It is more than wrapped, Agent Miller, I said, setting the heavy leather briefcase on the wooden table. It is tied with a bow. I unlatched the case and began laying out the architecture of my son and his greed. I did not rush. A watchmaker never rushes the presentation of a complex mechanism. I handed them the wire trace reports first. I explained how Marcus had bled the corporate accounts to prop up his failing equity fund. The 2 junior agents leaned forward, their eyes scanning the columns of stolen numbers. Then I handed them the county recorder files. The fraudulent commercial mortgage placed against my shop, carrying my forged signature, notarized by a corrupt lawyer named Desmond Hayes. Agent Miller picked up the mortgage document, holding it up to the harsh overhead lights, examining the forged ink. This is a federal banking violation, he murmured. 10 years mandatory minimum. That is just the foundation, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the heartbreak underneath. I pulled out the wealth management folder. I placed the irrevocable trust documents on the table. I watched the faces of the agents as they read the withdrawal history. I watched them realize that a father had stolen his 10-year-old son and his entire future, pulling small increments to avoid detection, funneling it all into a bottomless pit of debt. The room went completely dead quiet. Even seasoned federal agents have a line of point where corporate greed crosses into pure moral rot. Stealing from a child crosses that line. Finally, Tyrone reached into his own coat. He placed 2 more items on the table. A plastic evidence bag containing the small black recording device Marcus had hidden in my home, and a thick manila folder containing the sworn handwritten confession of a hired driver. Marcus bugged his own house, Tyrone explained, tapping the plastic bag. The audio files confirm his intent to defraud and his collusion with the notary. The folder contains a statement from Darnell Vance. Kendra Vance paid him $10,000 in cash to run her father-in-law down in an alley 4 days ago. Attempted murder conspiracy and wire fraud. They are a joint enterprise. Agent Miller closed the final folder. He sat back in his chair, pressing his fingers together. He looked at the mountain of paper, the undeniable absolute proof of a shattered family. Mr. Vance, Miller said, looking me right in the eye. This is one of the most comprehensive civilian dossiers I have ever seen. You have done our job for us. We have enough here to secure a grand jury indictment by tomorrow morning. We can arrest them before dinner. No, I said sharply. Miller frowned. Excuse me. If you arrest them now, it happens quietly, I explained, leaning over the table. They get a phone call, they hire defense attorneys, they bond out, and they spend the next 3 years spinning lies in a courtroom. They will claim the boy and his money was an accident. They will claim the hit and run was a misunderstanding. I will not give them the luxury of preparation. I want them caught, cornered, and exposed with absolutely nowhere to run. What are you proposing? Miller asked, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous curiosity. Christmas Eve, I said. It is exactly 3 weeks away. They are planning to come to my home for dinner. They are bringing Desmond Hayes with them. They intend to corner me, put a pen in my hand, and force me to sign away my business because they think I am senile and broken. I want to let them sit at my table. I want to let them spring their trap. And when they think they have won, I want you waiting outside my front door. Miller looked at Tyrone. Tyrone nodded slowly, a massive, silent agreement. Miller looked back at me. We need a signal, he said. I have a porch light, I replied. When the switch flips, the trap closes. Agent Miller stood up, extending his hand across the table. We will see you in 3 weeks, Mr. Vance. Keep the turkey warm. The morning of Christmas Eve was draped in a heavy, suffocating white snow. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, rattling the storm windows of my brownstone. Inside the house smelled of rosemary, roasted garlic, and the quiet, heavy anticipation of a storm about to break. I stood in the kitchen carefully basting a large turkey. The oven heat warmed my hands, but my chest felt like solid ice. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting in the unmarked suite. 21 days of maintaining the illusion, of shuffling my feet, of forgetting names, of playing the broken old man. Tonight, the performance would end. Jamal arrived at noon. He walked through the front door, stomping the snow from his boots, carrying a small wrapped box. He walked into the kitchen, setting the box on the counter, and immediately washed his hands. He did not ask what we were doing. He simply picked up a paring knife, pulled a cutting board toward him, and began slicing carrots with a meticulous, focused precision. He was 10 years old, but his eyes held the weary wisdom of a much older man. You are quiet today, Jamal, I said, leaning against the counter. He paused his cutting, looking out the frosted kitchen window into the gray afternoon. It feels weird today, Grandpa, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like everybody's holding their breath. I looked at the fraying cuff of his gray sweater, thinking about the empty trust fund, thinking about the absolute betrayal his father had orchestrated. I walked over, placing a hand on his small shoulder. Some storms are meant to clear the air, Jamal, I said. You just have to stay inside and wait for the thunder to pass." He nodded, trusting me completely, and went back to the carrots. At precisely 6 in the evening, the doorbell rang. It was an aggressive, impatient sound. I wiped my hands on a towel, taking a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump forward. I adjusted my face, letting my jaw go slightly slack, dialing the sharp focus out of my eyes. The master watchmaker retreated, and the senile, helpless old man took the stage. I opened the heavy oak door. The freezing wind whipped into the foyer, bringing them with it. Marcus stepped in first, shaking a dusting of snow from his expensive cashmere overcoat. He looked around the hallway with a proprietary air, like a landlord inspecting a newly acquired property. Kendra followed her designer heels, clicking sharply against the hardwood. She carried an expensive bottle of wine, a hollow offering for a man she had actively tried to murder just a few weeks prior. Her smile was tight, her eyes darting around the space, calculating, measuring. She looked at me, searching for the symptoms she believed she had chemically induced, and I rewarded her with a blank, confused stare. And then came the third man. Desmond Hayes stepped over the threshold, wiping his leather shoes on the mat with exaggerated care. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, holding a thick leather portfolio tight against his chest. He looked around my home with a greasy, practiced smile, his eyes lingering on the silver candlesticks, the antique clock in the hall, assessing the liquidation value of my entire life. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Marcus said, clapping his cold hands together, rubbing them briskly. "It smells wonderful in here. I hope you are feeling up to a little company." I gave him a weak, confused smile, blinking slowly. "Oh," I mumbled, staring at Desmond. "I did not realize we were having extra guests today." Marcus placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me forcefully toward the dining room. "Now, Dad, do not be rude," he said, using the condescending tone reserved for small children and the deeply unwell. "This is Desmond, remember? We brought him along because we have a few small things to go over tonight. Just some simple paperwork to get out of the way before the new year. It will only take a minute." Kendra walked into the dining room, setting the wine on the table. She looked at Jamal, who was standing quietly in the corner, watching them with dark, unreadable eyes. "Go play in your room, sweetie," Kendra said, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "The adults need to have a boring conversation." Jamal did not move. He looked at me, a silent question in his posture. I gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He turned, walking up the stairs, leaving me alone with the predators. They took their seats at my dining table. Desmond placed his thick leather portfolio directly next to his dinner plate, an ugly leather stain against my crisp white tablecloth. Marcus poured the wine, his face flushed with the arrogant certainty of a man who believes he has already won the game. They talked loudly, filling the room with empty noise, ignoring me completely unless they needed to patronize me. They thought they had backed an old broken watchmaker into a dark corner. They thought they were holding all the cards. They did not realize the door had just locked behind them and the timer had finally run out. I brought the roasted turkey to the table, my hands trembling just enough to make the heavy platter rattle against the ceramic plates. I set it down, breathing heavily, letting them see the effort it cost me. I walked back to the kitchen, fetching the garlic mashed potatoes, the roasted carrots Jamal had carefully prepared, and the fresh rolls. Every step I took was measured, slow, and deeply calculating. Kendra watched me with cold, assessing eyes, slicing the turkey meat with a sharp knife, her movements completely devoid of any real warmth. She poured herself a large glass of red wine, drinking it quickly, her nerves clearly sitting right on the surface of her skin. Marcus filled the silence with loud, empty stories, talking about his corporate victories, about the high-value commercial properties he was acquiring, building a massive castle of lies right in my dining room. He talked about wealth like it was a weapon he was wielding, swinging it around to show how big and important he was. Desmond ate quickly, chewing his food without really tasting it, his eyes constantly darting to the heavy leather portfolio resting by his water glass, like a man afraid his winning lottery ticket might suddenly blow away in a draft. I sat at the head of the table, eating my meal slowly, watching the gears turning in their desperate heads. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked a heavy rhythmic pulse, counting down the final seconds of their freedom. They waited exactly 20 minutes. They let me finish half a plate of food, assuming a full stomach would make me sluggish, tired, and deeply compliant. They assumed the warmth of the room, and the heavy holiday meal would dull whatever small senses I had left. Then Marcus set his silver fork down, wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin, and offered me a smile that looked exactly like a freshly sharpened blade. "Dad," Marcus said, leaning across the mahogany table, his voice dripping with that suffocating manufactured concern he had perfected over the last 6 months. "We were talking earlier about how much pressure you have been under lately. The shop is just too much for one person to manage, especially at your advanced age. We do not want you worrying about property taxes or inventory valuations or any of those complicated headaches anymore." I chewed a piece of turkey, slowly looking at him, with wide, vacant eyes playing the broken watchmaker to the absolute hilt. "What headaches?" I asked, letting my voice waver and crack. "The shop is completely fine, Marcus. I fixed the mainspring on the vintage Patek today. It is running perfectly." Marcus exchanged a quick, highly irritated look with Kendra. "See, Dad?" he said, his tone shifting into a patronizing, heavy hum. "You are getting confused again. The shop needs high-level administration, not just repair work. You need to rest your mind. You need to let me take the wheel before something goes terribly wrong and you lose everything you built." Right on cue, Desmond Hayes cleared his throat, sensing his moment had arrived. He reached over, unzipping the heavy leather portfolio, the sharp sound tearing through the quiet dining room like a gunshot. He pulled out a thick stack of crisp white legal paper, placing it squarely in the center of the table right next to the gravy boat. He smoothed the edges down his hands, slick with arrogant, unearned confidence. "Isaiah Desmond," said, using my first name, a calculated disrespect designed to establish his legal authority over a frail old man. "Marcus and Kendra are just looking out for your absolute best interests. This document is a comprehensive power of attorney coupled with a master asset transfer agreement. It simply transfers the legal burden of the commercial property and the business accounts into a manageable trust controlled strictly by your son. It ensures the legacy you built is protected from any unfortunate medical mistakes you might make in the future." He pulled a heavy gold-plated pen from his tailored breast pocket, clicking it open with his thumb, and laying it gently on top of the signature line. It was a beautiful, expensive pen, heavy and cold, the exact kind of tool used to sign away entire lays without spilling a single drop of actual blood. "Just a signature on the last page," Isaiah Desmond urged, leaning back in his chair, looking at me like a hungry butcher looks at a lamb. "And then we can get back to this wonderful, relaxing holiday dinner." I looked at the document sitting on the table. I looked at the gold pen resting on the paper. I looked at my son sitting directly across from me, his eyes burning with a desperate, naked hunger he could no longer hide. He was literally salivating over the black ink, waiting for me to surrender 50 years of blood and sweat and absolute dedication so he could sell it to a strip mall developer to pay off his massive debts by next Tuesday. I reached my arm out, my hand hovering slowly over the gold pen. Marcus completely stopped breathing. Kendra leaned forward in her chair, her manicured nails digging sharply into the edge of the mahogany table. Desmond offered a tight, deeply victorious smirk, calculating his crooked legal fee in his head. I stopped my hand just inches from the pen. I pulled it back slowly, resting it quietly on my lap. I looked at the three of them, letting the silence stretch, letting the anticipation curdle and sour in their mouths. "I do not think I want to sign this today," I said, my voice quiet but completely stripped of the trembling frailty I had been projecting for months. The air in the room instantly vanished. Marcus stared at me, his victorious smile freezing on his face, cracking wildly at the edges. Kendra let out a sharp, highly irritated breath, her eyes flashing with pure venom. Desmond lost his smirk, his slick professional mask slipping, revealing the sudden panic of a corrupt lawyer whose easy payday was suddenly resisting the program. Dad, Marcus said, his voice dropping its warm facade, hardening into something ugly, cold, and highly demanding. This is not a debate. We have gone through the immense trouble of bringing Desmond here on a holiday night. You need to sign the paperwork right now. It is for your own good. I looked at the signature line again, maintaining my unmovable posture. I do not understand these complicated words, Marcus. I lied, placing the confused elder one last time, turning the tension screw a little tighter. It says transfer of deeds. It says total liquidation authority. I do not want to liquidate my shop. I'm not ready to stop working my trade. Kendra slammed her flat hand hard on the table, making the expensive wine glasses rattle against the wood. You are 72 years old, Isaiah. She snapped her carefully crafted sweetness, completely vaporizing, exposing the absolute monster hiding underneath. You cannot even remember where you put your house keys half the time. You are a massive liability to yourself. Sign the paper right now before you burn that dusty old shop to the ground and leave us with absolutely nothing. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, the wealthy woman who had personally paid a street runner $10,000 to have me crushed against a brick wall, now openly demanding I hand over my entire life savings. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her greed was almost a marvel to witness. I am sorry, Kendra, I said, keeping my voice mild but entirely immovable like a stone pillar. I'm just not picking up that gold pen. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. His face was a dark, dangerous red, the thick veins in his neck bulging against his expensive silk collar. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face, the dutiful sun finally shedding his fake skin, revealing the cornered, desperate corporate rat hiding inside. Listen to me, you stubborn old man, Marcus hissed, leaning aggressively over the table, spitting the words with pure, unadulterated malice. You are signing that legal document tonight. Do you clearly understand me? You are signing it, or I swear to God I will have you declared legally incompetent by tomorrow morning, and I will take the shop anyway. I will throw you in a depressing state medical facility, and I will sell every broken clock in that place for cheap scrap. Pick up the pen right now. The tension in the dining room was absolute, a tightly wound mainspring sitting right at the snapping point. Desmond looked terrified of the outburst. Kendra looked violently furious, and Marcus looked fully ready to physically force my hand onto the paper. They were completely focused on me, entirely consumed by their own violent, rushing greed. Which is exactly why none of them noticed the heavy footsteps crunching on the snow-covered front porch until the doorbell finally beautifully rang. The doorbell rang, a sharp, sudden sound, cutting right through the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. Marcus froze, his mouth still open, his pointing finger suspended in the space between us. The violent, arrogant momentum he had built up simply slammed into a brick wall. Kendra jumped in her seat, spilling a dark drop of expensive red wine onto the pristine white tablecloth. Desmond Hayes blinked rapidly, looking toward the hallway with the nervous twitch of a man who knew his business belonged in the shadows, not in the light of an unexpected guest. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wood scraping softly against the floor. I stood up with the quiet, unshakable dignity of a man who still owned the roof over his head and the floor beneath his feet. Who in the world is that, Marcus? Snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh, agitated whisper. Do not answer it, Dad. We are right in the middle of crucial family business. I ignored my son completely. I walked out of the dining room, moving down the hallway with a steady, deliberate pace. I reached the heavy oak door, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled it open. The brutal Chicago winter rushed into the foyer, bringing a swirl of freezing white snow, and a blast of air so cold it burned the lungs. Standing on my front porch, perfectly framed by the harsh yellow glow of the porch light, was a stranger. He was a massive man hunched over against the biting wind, shivering violently. He wore a battered dark canvas coat stained with city grime and frayed heavily at the cuffs. A torn wool hat was pulled low over his eyes, hiding the sharp, intelligent focus I knew was burning right underneath the brim. He rubbed his thick hands together, his breath pluming in massive white clouds in the freezing air. It was Tyrone, executing his role with the flawless precision of an undercover federal operative. "Please, sir." The stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, pitched perfectly to sound broken and desperate. "I'm so sorry to bother you on a holiday night, but the shelters downtown are completely full, and the wind chill is dropping fast. I just need a moment of warmth and maybe a scrap of food before I keep moving." Before I could even answer, heavy footsteps marched down the hallway behind me. Marcus appeared at my shoulder, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the massive, shivering man on the porch, not seeing a human being in need, but seeing a filthy obstacle blocking his path to my bank accounts. "Shut the door, Data," Marcus demanded, stepping forward, trying to physically crowd me out of the doorway. "We do not know this vagrant. He's probably casing the neighborhood. You cannot just let random homeless people into the house." From the dining room, Kendra raised her voice, dripping with elite wealthy entitlement. "Marcus, tell him to go away right now," she called out, sounding genuinely offended by the interruption. "I'm not eating my dinner with a street beggar in the house." I turned my head slowly, looking at my son. He was wearing a suit that cost $3,000 a watch, that cost $10,000, and he was standing in a house he was actively trying to steal, telling me to turn away, a freezing man on Christmas Eve. The absolute moral bankruptcy of his soul was finally completely laid bare. "It is Christmas Eve, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, dropping the frail act entirely for just a moment. "And this is my house. I pay the mortgage, I own the deed, and no man freezes on my front porch tonight." I turned back to the stranger, opening the heavy oak door completely wide. "Come inside, son," I said softly, stepping aside to clear the path. The stranger stepped into the warm foyer, bringing the smell of cold snow and wet canvas with him. "Thank you, sir," he mumbled, keeping his head bowed down, playing the part of a beaten, discarded man to absolute perfection. "You are a good man." Marcus let out a loud, furious scoff, throwing his hands up in the air in sheer exasperation. "This is unbelievable," Marcus hissed, storming back down the hallway toward the dining room. "You are losing your mind, Isaiah." "You are completely losing your mind." I guided the stranger down the hall, leading him directly into the dining room. The moment we stepped into the light, the temperature in the room plummeted. Kendra pushed her chair back, pulling her expensive designer sweater tightly around her shoulders, looking at the stranger like he was carrying a deadly plague. Desmond Hayes scooted his chair slightly away nervously, placing his hand flat on top of his leather portfolio, protecting his fraudulent paperwork from the sudden chaotic variable that had just walked into his controlled environment. I pulled out a chair at the far end of the long mahogany table directly opposite Desmond and right next to Marcus. "Sit down right here," I said, offering the stranger the seat. The massive man sat down slowly, keeping his torn hat pulled low. His broad shoulders hunched forward. He looked at the mountain of hot food on the table, the roasted turkey, the garlic potatoes, the warm rolls. He swallowed hard, a perfect performance of deep, starving gratitude. Marcus stared at the man sitting next to him, his face rigid with fury. He looked at me, pointing a sharp finger at the table. "You are making a massive mistake, Dad." Marcus warned, his voice a low, dangerous threat. "We are trying to save your life, and you are inviting trash off the street to eat our dinner." I picked up an empty plate, filled it high with hot food, and placed it gently in front of the stranger. The gears in a watch only jam when something dirty gets trapped inside the mechanism. I said, looking directly at my son. A cold, sharp truth hidden right beneath my words. I think it is time we see exactly what kind of dirt is sitting at my table tonight. Eat up, son, I told the stranger. You look like a man who knows how to finish a job. The stranger ate. He did not rush, and he did not gorge himself. He held the silver fork with large, steady hands, taking careful bites of the hot food. The room around him was incredibly tense, filled with a thick, suffocating silence. Marcus watched him with absolute disgust, his face red with suppressed rage. Kendra stared at her wineglass, refusing to look at the man in the dirty coat. Desmond Hayes tapped his manicured fingers rapidly against his heavy leather portfolio, clearly agitated by the sudden, unpredictable delay. After exactly 4 minutes, Marcus could not take it anymore. He leaned forward, pushing the crisp white paperwork closer to my plate. Listen, Dad, Marcus said, his voice a tight, demanding hiss. Let us just finish this right now. Sign the document so we can all move on with our evening. The stranger set his fork down. The soft clink of the metal against the ceramic plate was the only sound in the entire dining room. He picked up a linen napkin and wiped his mouth slowly. When he looked up, he did not look like a freezing beggar anymore. His posture straightened his broad shoulders, filling out the battered canvas coat. He looked directly at the legal paperwork sitting on the table. Is that a springing power of attorney? The stranger asked, his voice suddenly losing every trace of the raspy, broken tremble. Or is it a direct asset transfer? The room went dead silent. Marcus snapped his head toward the massive man, his eyes wide with shock. Shut your mouth, Marcus yelled, pointing a furious finger. You eat your free food and you keep completely quiet. The stranger completely ignored Marcus. He locked his dark, intelligent eyes directly on Desmond Hayes. Desmond swallowed hard. The slick, corrupt lawyer saw something in the stranger that he instantly recognized. He saw the cold, unyielding, and incredibly precise stare of a federal investigator. Because if it is a direct asset transfer, the stranger continued, his voice smooth and devastatingly articulate, that requires the principal to be of fully sound mind at the exact moment of signing. But if I'm not mistaken, there is currently a secret petition for conservatorship sitting quietly in the Cook County Probate Court, filed exactly 8 weeks ago by the very people sitting at this table. Desmond went completely pale. His expensive tan turned to a sickly ash gray. He pulled his hand away from his leather portfolio, acting like the thick stack of paper was suddenly on fire. Who are you? Desmond asked, his voice cracking into a terrified whisper. Marcus slammed his fist hard on the mahogany table. He is a bum off the street, Desmond. Marcus shouted, his panic turning into loud aggression. Why in the world are you talking to him? He's not a bum, Marcus, Kendra said, her voice shaking violently with a sudden, terrible realization. She looked at the massive man sitting near her husband, her eyes stretching wide with pure, absolute terror. The stranger reached his thick hand into the inside pocket of his dirty canvas coat. He did not pull out a beggar tin. He pulled out a sleek, encrypted black smartphone. He placed it gently on the table right next to the gravy boat. Filing a voluntary transfer document, the stranger said, keeping his eyes deadlocked on the corrupt lawyer, while simultaneously holding a secret court petition claiming the principal is legally senile, is a massive, disparable ethical violation. But you know all about violations, Desmond. Do you not? Desmond pushed his chair back slightly, the wood squeaking against the floor. I do not know what you are talking about, the lawyer stammered, wiping a sudden bead of sweat from his forehead. I'm talking about Cook County Notary. License number 4829. the stranger said, reciting the specific numbers with brutal surgical accuracy. "I'm talking about a commercial mortgage filed 6 months ago. A mortgage carrying a blatantly forged signature verified and sealed by your personal official notary stamp. That is not just a simple ethical violation, Desmond. That is federal mortgage fraud." The air was sucked completely out of the dining room. Marcus stared at the stranger, his arrogant, wealthy face finally breaking apart into pure, unadulterated confusion. He looked at Desmond, and then he looked back at the massive man in the ragged coat. Kendra gripped her crystal wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned completely white, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Desmond Hayes was breathing fast, his eyes darting wildly around the room. He looked at the front hallway. He looked at the stranger. He looked at me sitting completely calm and still at the head of the table. The grand illusion of the frail, senile old man had completely vanished from my posture. I sat straight, my back rigid, my eyes sharp and fully focused. I watched the corrupt lawyer realize in real time that he had walked blindly into a meticulously constructed fatal trap. "This is a setup," Desmond whispered, his hands shaking so badly he had to hide them under the table. "You are an accessory to a massive federal crime." "Desmond," the stranger said, leaning forward, using his sheer physical presence to completely dominate the room. "You rubber-stamped a fake multi-$100,000 mortgage. You authorized automated illegal withdrawals from an irrevocable trust belonging to a 10-year-old boy. You helped a desperate, failing corporate liquidator steal from his own father. And you carried his fraudulent, poisoned paperwork into this house tonight, attempting to finish the robbery." Marcus stood up, his legs shaking, his chair falling backwards onto the hardwood floor with a loud, violent crash. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his corporate confidence completely shattered into a million pieces. "Dad." Marcus stammered, his voice high and terrified. "What is going on here?" I looked at my son, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy, undeniable truth. "What is going on, Marcus?" I said, my voice cutting through the warm room like a perfectly sharpened jeweler blade. "Is that the gears are finally catching, and your time has run completely out?" Desmond Hayes looked at me, and then he looked at the massive man sitting across the table. The slick, arrogant veneer of the corporate lawyer completely melted away, leaving nothing but the terrified sweat of a cornered rat. He knew exactly what the stranger meant, and he knew exactly what the federal penalties for mortgage fraud were. "I am leaving." Desmond announced, his voice a frantic, high-pitched squeak. He did not reach for his heavy leather portfolio. He left the fraudulent paperwork, the expensive gold pen, and the fake transfer agreement sitting right next to the gravy boat. Marcus spun around, his face completely twisted with aggressive sudden shock. "Where are you going, Desmond?" Marcus demanded, reaching out to violently grab the sleeve of the lawyer. "We are right in the middle of closing this deal. Tell this homeless trash to get out of my house right now." Desmond ripped his arm away, shoving Marcus backward with surprising violent force. "Do not touch me, Marcus!" Desmond yelled, his eyes darting frantically toward the front hallway, looking for the fastest exit. "There is no deal. There is no asset transfer. You lied to me about the court petition, and you lied to me about your father. I am not losing my entire law license for your failing equity fund, and I am certainly not going to a federal penitentiary for your forged mortgage document." Marcus stumbled back, hitting the edge of the dining table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle violently against the mahogany wood. "Forged mortgage." Kendra whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden chaos. "Marcus, what in the world is he talking about?" Marcus completely ignored his wife, stepping aggressively toward the fleeing lawyer. "Desmond, get back here right now!" Marcus roared, his corporate authority collapsing into sheer pathetic panic. "You work for me. You fix this paperwork right now." But Desmond was already gone. He sprinted down the hallway, his leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished floor. He did not even bother to grab his expensive wool overcoat from the hall closet. He hit the heavy oak front door, fumbling wildly with the brass deadbolt, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the lock. He threw the heavy door open, letting the freezing, howling Chicago blizzard violently rush back into the warm house. He ran straight out into the deep snow, wearing only his thin charcoal suit, abandoning his wealthy clients and his entire corrupt career in a matter of seconds. The front door stood wide open, the freezing winter wind blowing a thick layer of white snow directly onto the hardwood floor of my foyer. Marcus stood perfectly still, breathing heavily, staring at the empty dark doorway. He looked like an arrogant king who had just watched his entire castle crumble into absolute dust. "Close the door, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and entirely steady. "You are letting the winter inside." Marcus slowly turned his head, looking at me with eyes full of a wild, unhinged desperation. He walked mechanically down the hall, pushing the heavy oak door shut against the howling wind, locking out the freezing cold and locking himself completely inside the trap. He walked back into the dining room, his expensive cashmere suit rumpled, his carefully styled hair blown out of place. He looked at the massive stranger still sitting quietly at the end of the table. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of violent rage and profound fear. "Are you a police officer? Because if you are a cop, you need a signed warrant to be in this house. My father is a deeply senile man, and he cannot legally invite you inside." The stranger did not answer right away. He simply reached his thick hand back into the inside pocket of his dirty canvas coat. Kendra backed away from the dining table, her designer heels clicking nervously against the floor. She looked at me, her eyes wide frantically, scanning my face for the frail, broken old man she had been actively poisoning with spiked tea for months. She did not find him. She only found the master watchmaker sitting tall in his chair, looking back at her with absolute unyielding clarity. "You are not sick," Kendra whispered, the horrifying realization finally hitting her like a physical blow to the chest. The tea, the confusion, the memory loss. "You faked the entire thing. I faked nothing." "Kendra," I said, folding my hands neatly on the table, resting them near my cold plate of food. "I simply gave you exactly what you paid to see. A good watchmaker knows that if you want to catch a greedy thief, you leave the heavy safe completely unlocked and you step back into the quiet shadows." Marcus stared at me, his jaw completely clenched, his breathing turning shallow and fast. "You set us up," Marcus hissed, his fists balling tightly at his eyes darting between me and the massive man. "You brought this fake homeless man here to scare away my lawyer and ruin my legitimate business. You are a bitter, jealous old man, and you are trying to destroy your own son." "I did not destroy anything, Marcus," I said softly, feeling the heavy, tragic weight of the evening finally settling over my shoulders. "I just sat quietly and watched you destroy yourself." Kendra raised her hands to her mouth, her chest heaving as full-blown panic began to take over her body. "If he knows about the tea," she stammered, her eyes darting frantically toward the hallway, looking toward the door that Desmond had just used to escape. "Marcus, if he knows about the tea, what else does he know?" Marcus turned to his wife, his face contorted in vicious, desperate anger. "Shut up, Kendra!" he yelled, his voice echoing loudly in the dining room. "Do not say another word in front of this man. We are leaving right now. Get your coat." Marcus took a step toward the hallway, fully intending to follow his corrupt lawyer out into the freezing snow, fully intending to run away from the massive collapse of his fake wealthy life. But the stranger at the end of the table finally spoke again. "I would not do that if I were you," the massive man said, his deep, gravelly voice carrying an undeniable, terrifying authority. "The snow is very deep outside, and you are carrying far too much debt to walk through it. Marcus froze in his tracks. He turned around slowly, his face drained of all color, finally realizing that the deep black hole he had dug for his father was the exact same hole he was currently standing in. Marcus stood frozen in the dining room, looking at the massive man sitting at the end of the mahogany table. "Who in the world are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice cracking, completely losing its previous arrogant thunder. The stranger reached into his battered canvas coat, but he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek black leather wallet, flipping it open and tossing it flat onto the center of the table. It slid across the smooth wood, stopping right next to the abandoned fraudulent transfer papers. "My name is Tyrone Washington," the massive man said, his deep voice carrying the absolute unyielding weight of the federal government. "I am a private investigator licensed in the state of Illinois, and a former senior agent with the United States Department of the Treasury." Marcus stared at the leather wallet, seeing the heavy silver badge pinned inside and the official embossed identification card. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. He looked at Tyrone and then he looked directly at me. "You hired a federal investigator," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling, his corporate armor completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified, cornered thief. "I did not just hire him, Marcus," I said, leaning forward in my chair, locking my eyes directly onto my son. "I grew up with him. His father taught me everything I know about patience, about precision, and about watching the tiny hidden gears turn inside a complex machine. You thought I was just a frail, broken old man, spending my final days losing my memory in a dusty shop. You thought you could simply manipulate me, drug me, and steal 50 years of my life without me ever noticing the missing pieces." I reached under the edge of the dining table, pulling out a thick, heavy leather briefcase I had hidden there earlier in the afternoon. I lifted it up, placing it directly in the center of the table, the heavy brass clasps hitting the wood with a loud, final thud. I popped the locks open, the sharp metal click echoing loudly in the quiet room. "What is that?" Kendra asked, her voice shaking violently, taking another terrified step backward toward the hallway. "That is your absolute destruction, Kendra," I said, keeping my voice cold and perfectly level. Tyrone stood up from his chair, his massive frame towering over the dining table. He reached into the open briefcase, pulling out a massive, thick stack of bound legal documents. He threw them onto the table, the heavy paper slapping against the wood like a physical blow. "Those are forensic wire trace reports," Tyrone said, pointing a thick, accusing finger at the stack. "We pulled them directly from your failing private equity shell accounts. We have 18 solid months of transaction history showing exactly how you illegally bled your corporate accounts, desperately trying to cover your massive, catastrophic real estate losses. We know exactly how deep in debt you are, Marcus. We know you owe millions to people who do not take no for an answer." Marcus shook his head rapidly, a desperate, frantic denial. "You cannot prove any of that," Marcus stammered, holding his hands up, trying to push the reality away. "Those are just numbers on a page. My accountants handle everything. I do not touch the daily transfers." Tyrone let out a dark, humorless laugh, pulling a second, thicker folder from the heavy briefcase. He tossed it onto the table right on top of the wire traces. "Then I suppose your accountants also forged your father and his signature on a commercial mortgage document," Tyrone said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Because that file contains the certified Cook County recorder deed. It shows a $450,000 loan taken out against the vintage watch shop, verified by your cowardly lawyer who just ran out into the snow. The signature is a blatant, highly documented forgery. That is federal mortgage fraud, Marcus. That is a mandatory minimum sentence locked inside a concrete cell." Marcus stared at the county seal on the folder, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with the sudden crushing weight of the trap. He looked at me, his eyes begging for a way out, searching for the soft, forgiving father he had spent his entire life taking advantage of. "Dad," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. You have to listen to me. I was going to pay it all back. The market shifted, the properties lost value, and I just needed a temporary bridge loan. I was going to sell the shop, clear the corporate debts, and put you in a beautiful luxury care facility. I was trying to protect you. You were trying to liquidate me, I corrected him, my voice completely devoid of any pity or warmth. You looked at my life, my trade, and my home, and you saw nothing but a pile of scrap metal you could sell to save your own pathetic, empty empire. But I could forgive the mortgage, Marcus. I am an old man, and money is just money. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence fill the dining room. I reached into the briefcase myself, pulling out the final, thinnest folder. It was the file with the wealth management logo. I held it in my hands for a moment, feeling the cold, tragic weight of what my son had done. But I can never ever forgive this, I said, tossing the thin folder onto the table, letting it slide right to the edge, stopping inches from Marcus. Marcus looked down at the wealth management logo. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, stepping back as if the folder was a venomous snake. That is an irrevocable trust ledger, Tyrone announced, his voice dropping all pretense, sounding like a judge delivering a fatal verdict. Funded with $200,000 meant entirely for a 10-year-old boy. And we have the complete, undeniable bank records showing exactly how you submitted forged guardian authorizations to systematically drain your own son and his future down to the very last penny. Marcus collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his trembling hands, finally realizing that the entire massive structure of his lies had completely crushed him. The dining room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Marcus sat completely broken, his face buried in his trembling hands, the undeniable proof of his stolen trust fund sitting inches away. He had traded his own flesh and blood, his only child, for a few more months of pretending to be a wealthy corporate king. But the trap was not entirely closed because Kendra was still standing. Kendra looked at her husband, a fast, calculating coldness sweeping over her panicked features. She took a deliberate step away from Marcus, physically distancing herself from the collapsing wreckage of his life. I had absolutely nothing to do with that. Kendra announced, her voice shaking, but finding a sharp, desperate edge. I did not sign any mortgage documents, Isaiah. I did not know he was draining Jamal and his trust fund. Marcus handles all the corporate finances, and I'm just his wife. You cannot tie me to his federal banking crimes. Marcus lifted his head from his hands, staring at his wife in sheer, breathless disbelief. You are abandoning me, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with utter betrayal. We spent the money together, Kendra. You knew exactly how deep the debts were. I knew nothing, Kendra snapped, glaring at him with pure venom. I am leaving, and I am calling my own attorney. She turned her expensive designer heels toward the hallway, fully intending to walk right out the front door, leaving Marcus to drown alone. I would stay exactly where you are, Kendra, I said, my voice cutting through her escape plan like a heavy iron gate slamming shut. Because the financial documents are only the first part of the presentation. Kendra froze, her back stiffening. She slowly turned around, her eyes darting between me and the heavy leather briefcase still sitting on the table. Tyrone reached into the briefcase again. He pulled out a small, clear plastic evidence bag holding a black rectangular audio recorder. He tossed it onto the table, letting it slide right next to the gravy boat. Do you recognize this, Marcus? I asked, looking at my son. Marcus stared at the small black box, his eyes widening in pure horror. He recognized it immediately. It was the exact same device he had carefully taped underneath the bookshelf in my living room weeks ago. You bugged my house, I said, leaning forward, lacing my fingers together. You wanted to spy on me, and you wanted to spy on your wife, trying to capture her plotting against you. But Tyrone is a federal investigator, and he sweeps a room better than anyone in Chicago. He found your little toy, he swapped it for a kitchen timer, and he took the original. Tyrone reached over, pressing the play button on the small device. The audio was crystal clear, filling the dining room with the undeniable sound of Marcus in his own voice. The recording played. It was Marcus talking on his cell phone, pacing in my living room. "We need to isolate Kendra," the recorded voice of Marcus said, sounding cold and calculating. "I filed the declaration of limited involvement yesterday. On paper, she is making all the primary medical decisions for the old man. If the poison tea blows up in our faces or the doctors get suspicious, she takes the entire fall for elder abuse. I stay completely clean." Tyrone pressed the stop button. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Kendra stared at Marcus, her face twisting into a mask of pure, violent hatred. "You set me up!" Kendra hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer fury. "You planted evidence to throw me in prison so you could steal his money and walk away." "I did what I had to do," Marcus yelled back, his fear turning into cornered, vicious aggression. "You were getting reckless, Kendra. You were making stupid mistakes, and the corporate debts were drowning me. They were tearing each other apart right in my dining room, their fake wealthy marriage completely dissolving into a pool of toxic greed. But they still did not understand the absolute depth of the hole they were standing in. "You are both going to prison," Kendra screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me and then at Marcus. "I'm going to the police tomorrow morning and I'm testifying against both of you. I will tell them everything about the forged mortgage and the stolen trust fund. I am getting full immunity." "No, Kendra Tyrone," said his deep voice rolling over her, screaming like a heavy thunderstorm. "You are not getting immunity. You are getting 25 years. Tyrone reached into the briefcase for the absolute final time. He pulled out a thick standard manila folder. He opened it, taking out a 3-page handwritten document, and placed it flat on the mahogany table. Kendra looked at the handwritten pages. Her face, previously flushed with violent anger, instantly drained of all color. She stopped breathing completely, her eyes locking onto the signature at the very bottom of the page. "That is a sworn, legally binding confession," Tyrone explained, stepping closer to the table, towering over the terrified woman. "Signed yesterday evening by a street runner named Darnell Vance. He drives a gray sedan missing a passenger side mirror. Does that sound familiar, Kendra?" Kendra stumbled backward, hitting the wall, her legs completely giving out. She slid down, sitting on the hardwood floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. "Darnell Vance had a very bad morning last Thursday." Tyrone continued, his voice cold and entirely merciless. "He accelerated his car into a brick wall in a narrow alleyway, trying to run down a 72-year-old man. When I caught him, he was more than happy to make a federal deal. He stated on the official record that a wealthy woman named Kendra gave him $5,000 in a brown paper bag with a promise of $5,000 more to stage a fatal hit and run." Marcus stared at his wife sitting on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. "You tried to run him over?" Marcus whispered, his voice hollow, completely stunned by the sheer violent escalation. "You tried to murder my father in the street. I did it for us," Kendra sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Her arrogant elite facade completely shattered into a million pathetic pieces. The tea was taking too long and the bank was going to foreclose on the penthouse. "I panicked, Marcus. I just panicked." "You are a monster," Marcus yelled, stepping away from her, trying to distance himself from a federal attempted murder charge. "You are both monsters," I said, standing up slowly from the head of the table. "You are two broken, empty gears grinding against each other, completely destroying everything you touch. You thought you were so much smarter than the old Watchmaker. You thought my silence was weakness and my patience was senility." I walked around the table, standing right in front of my trembling son and his sobbing wife. I looked at the cold, untouched holiday food, The fraudulent legal papers, the wire traces, the audio bug, and the signed murder confession all scattered across the beautiful mahogany wood. But a watchmaker knows exactly how to build a cage out of time, I said, looking down at them with absolute undeniable finality. And your time is officially up. I stood over them in the dining room, looking at the absolute ruin they had made of their own lives. Marcus was staring at the floor, his broad shoulders hunched forward, looking exactly like a hollow, empty shell of a man. Kendra was still sobbing quietly against the wall. Her expensive makeup ruined, her designer clothes crumpled on the hardwood floor. They had walked into my house thinking they were the apex predators, the absolute masters of the universe, ready to put a pin in the hand of a broken old man. Now they were just two terrified criminals completely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of their own greed. "You know, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet space between us. For a long time, I blamed myself. I sat at my workbench examining the tiny, intricate gears of 100 different watches, wondering where I went wrong in raising you. I wondered if I worked too many late nights at the shop, if I missed too many baseball games, if I somehow failed to put the right moral mainspring inside your chest. Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes red and brimming with pathetic, self-pitying tears. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking into a desperate plea. "I am your only son. You cannot let them put me in a federal cage. I will give it all back. I will sign the trust fund over. I will void the mortgage tomorrow. Just let me walk out of that front door." I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep, profound unease wash over me, a grief for the son I had lost a very long time ago. "You cannot give back what is already gone, Marcus," I told him, my tone completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "You cannot just void the absolute terror you put your wife through, forcing her into a desperate corner. You cannot just unforge a federal document, and you certainly cannot refund the pure, absolute betrayal you inflicted on a 10-year-old boy. Jamal sat right here in this house today, peeling carrots in my kitchen, knowing his own father was coming here to steal from his grandfather. He felt the coldness in your heart long before I ever saw the paperwork." Kendra let out a sharp, ragged wail from the floor. "Isaiah, I am sorry," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands again. "I was just so frightened of losing everything." "You did not lose anything, Kendra," I corrected her, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on Marcus. "You threw it away. You both threw it all away for empty penthouses and expensive suits and a desperate need to pretend you were better than the people who actually loved you. A watch only holds its value if it tells the truth about the time. The second it starts lying, it is just a worthless piece of metal. You are both completely worthless now." Tyrone took a slow, deliberate step back, pulling his heavy canvas coat tight around his massive shoulders, giving me the physical space to finish the job. He had done his part flawlessly. He had gathered the undeniable truth, laid it bare on the mahogany table, and cornered the desperate thieves. The final movement, the absolute closing of the trap, belonged entirely to me. I turned away from the dining table. I left the wire traces, the forged mortgage deed, the audio bug, and the signed murder confession sitting right next to the cold roasted turkey. I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps steady and rhythmic on the hardwood floor, sounding exactly like the ticking of a perfectly calibrated grandfather clock. I reached the heavy oak front door. The winter storm was still howling violently outside, rattling the frosted glass panes, but inside the foyer the air was perfectly still. I placed my hand against the cold wood of the doorframe. I did not feel any hesitation, and I did not feel any doubt. I'd spent 50 years fixing broken things, but I finally understood that some things are simply shattered beyond repair, and the only thing left to do is to finally sweep up the dangerous glass. I looked back down the hallway toward the dining room. Marcus was watching me, his face frozen in pure, unadulterated terror, finally realizing that his expensive corporate tongue could not talk his way out of this room. "I love you, Marcus," I said quietly, speaking the final, honest truth of a heartbroken father. "But I will never, ever let you hurt this family again." I reached out my right hand, my fingers brushing against the cold brass wall plate. And with a single absolute motion, I flicked the porch light switch. The click of the light switch was a small sound, but it echoed down the hallway with the force of a falling anvil. I stood perfectly still with my hand resting near the brass plate, and I watched the front door. The wait was not long. It took exactly 4 seconds for the darkness outside to explode into blinding, chaotic red and blue light. The heavy oak door did not just open, it was violently breached, swinging inward so hard the brass knob punched a deep hole directly into the plaster wall. Federal agents poured into the foyer, moving with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. There were at least a dozen of them wearing dark tactical gear, the heavy letters of the Bureau stenciled across their reinforced vests. The howling Chicago blizzard rushed in behind them, blowing thick white snow across the polished hardwood floors, instantly ruining the pristine, expensive aesthetic my son cared so much about. Federal agents, a loud, commanding voice shouted over the wind. Nobody move a single muscle. Special Agent Miller stepped through the threshold, his dark overcoat dusted with fresh snow. He did not look like a man arriving at a holiday dinner. He looked like the absolute embodiment of inevitable, crushing justice. He walked past me with a curt professional nod, leading his tactical team straight down the hallway and directly into the dining room. Marcus had stood up from his chair, his hands raised in the air, his face completely drained of blood. He looked at the armed agents flooding his childhood home, and his fake corporate bravado made one final pathetic attempt to save him. "You cannot do this," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking wildly in the sudden chaos. "I am a senior corporate partner. I demand to speak to my legal counsel immediately. This is an illegal entry." Agent Miller did not slow down, and he certainly did not care about my son and his corporate title. Miller stepped right up to Marcus, grabbed the lapels of his $3,000 cashmere suit, and forcefully spun him around. Marcus slammed face first against the beautiful mahogany dining table, his cheek pressing directly onto the space where his fraudulent forged mortgage documents had been sitting just moments before. Marcus Vance. Agent Miller announced, his voice a flat, uncompromising hammer. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and the embezzlement of a minor trust." The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around the wrists of my son, the loud metallic clicks sounding exactly like a prison cell slamming completely shut. Marcus thrashed wildly against the wood, his expensive shoes slipping on the floor. But the federal agents held him down with effortless, absolute control. Dad Marcus sobbed, turning his head sideways against the table, his tears soaking right into the linen tablecloth. "Dad, please tell them to stop. You cannot let them take me in handcuffs. I am your son." I stood in the doorway of the dining room, my hands resting quietly at my sides. I did not move forward, and I did not flinch. "You are not my son right now, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the raid. "Right now you are just a thief who finally ran out of time." On the other side of the room, Kendra was completely hysterical. She tried to crawl backward away from the tactical boots surrounding her, screaming at the top of her lungs, dragging her expensive designer dress across the floor. "I am the victim here," Kendra wailed, kicking her legs wildly, her face a smeared, ruined mask of expensive makeup and pure terror. "He forced me to do it. He controlled the money. I did not want to hurt the old man." A female federal agent stepped forward, completely ignoring the desperate performance. She hauled Kendra up from the floor by the arms of her designer sweater, spinning her around and locking a pair of heavy steel cuffs onto her wrists. "Kendra Vance," the agent said, speaking directly into her ear. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder in the first degree." Kendra let out a horrifying, ear-piercing shriek, finally understanding that her wealthy elite privilege could not buy her way out of a murder charge. She collapsed into dead weight, forcing two federal agents to physically drag her out of the dining room, her expensive heels scraping uselessly across the floor. She screamed my name over and over again as they pulled her down the hallway, but I did not look at her. Agent Miller turned his attention to the dining table. He looked at the roasted turkey, the cold potatoes, and the absolute mountain of damning evidence Tyrone had neatly arranged. He looked at the clear plastic evidence bag holding the audio bug and the thick folder containing the sworn murder confession. "Secure everything on this table," Miller ordered, waving his tactical team forward. "Bag the electronics log, the county recorder files, and get those wire traces into the evidence lockbox. This entire room is an active federal crime scene." The agents moved quickly, sweeping up the fake ruined empire Marcus had tried to build. They took his fraudulent transfer agreement. They took his expensive gold pen. And they took the absolute undeniable proof of his stolen trust fund. Everything he valued, everything he used to hurt this family was bagged, tagged, and carried out into the freezing night. Tyrone Washington stood quietly in the corner of the room, his heavy canvas coat blending into the shadows. He watched the agents dismantle the predators with a grim, deeply satisfied expression. He caught my eye, offering a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging that the massive, complex mechanism we had built had executed its final turn with flawless, devastating precision. They pulled Marcus up from the table, dragging him forcefully toward the front door. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, defeated shell of a corporate liquidator, his tailored suit wrinkled and covered in the dust of his own shattered lies. He looked at me one last time as they dragged him past the foyer, his eyes searching for any remaining scrap of pity. He found absolutely nothing. The heavy oak door closed behind them, cutting off the howling wind and plunging the house back into a deep, sudden silence. The flashing red and blue lights painted the front windows, slowly fading away as the federal convoy drove out of my neighborhood, carrying my son to a concrete cell he would not leave for a very long time. I walked slowly back into the dining room, looking at the empty chairs and the quiet destruction left behind by the raid. The white tablecloth was stained with spilled wine, and the chairs were pushed back at sharp, chaotic angles. I reached down, picking up a single silver fork from the floor, and placed it neatly back onto the table. There is a profound, deep peace that comes when a massive lie is finally dragged out into the light and completely destroyed. I walked to the bottom of the staircase, looking up into the dark hallway of the second floor. Jamal was up there, safe from the storm. The absolute worst of the winter wind had finally passed, and the roof had held firm against the pressure. I placed my hand on the wooden banister, taking a deep, clean breath for the first time in 6 months. The trap was empty, and the house belonged entirely to me again. The month of February arrived with a cold, clear sky over Chicago. The violent, chaotic blizzard from Christmas Eve was entirely gone. The heavy snow had melted away from the sidewalks, leaving the city sharp, bright, and completely awake. My house was deeply quiet, but it was a vastly different kind of quiet. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of a hidden trap waiting to spring. It was the peaceful, breathing quiet of a strong structure that had successfully survived a massive storm. Jamal was at his middle school. He was doing very well. The dark, heavy shadows of anxiety had finally lifted from his young eyes, replaced by the bright, curious spark that belonged to a 10-year-old boy. Covering his face with his trembling hands, finally realizing that the entire massive structure of his lies had completely crushed him. The dining room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Marcus sat completely broken, his face buried in his trembling hands, the undeniable proof of his stolen trust fund sitting inches away. He had traded his own flesh and blood, his only child, for a few more months of pretending to be a wealthy corporate king. But the trap was not entirely closed, because Kendra was still standing. Kendra looked at her husband, a fast, calculating coldness sweeping over her panicked features. She took a deliberate step away from Marcus, physically distancing herself from the collapsing wreckage of his life. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that. Kendra," announced her voice, shaking, but finding a sharp, desperate edge. "I did not sign any mortgage documents, Isaiah. I did not know he was draining Jamal and his trust fund. He surrendered his entire law license, and he gave the federal prosecution everything they needed to completely dismantle the illegal mortgage." I took a slow, warming sip of the hot coffee. "The vintage watch shop belongs entirely to me again?" I asked, needing to hear the absolute confirmation. Patricia nodded once, a firm, unyielding gesture. "The property deed is completely clear," she said, her voice carrying absolute professional certainty. "The bank recognized the massive, systemic fraud, and they voided the commercial debt entirely. You owe them absolutely nothing, Isaiah. Your business is completely safe." We moved on to the second legal file on her desk. This was the specific folder that mattered the absolute most to me. The irrevocable trust fund set up for Jamal. The sacred money Marcus had systematically drained, trying to steal a bright future right from his own blood. Patricia opened the heavy ledger, running her finger down the long column of number. "The federal prosecutors have successfully frozen all of your son and his remaining corporate assets," Patricia explained, pointing to a long, detailed list of seized bank accounts. "Because the stolen trust money was funneled directly into those failing equity shells, the government is strictly prioritizing the financial restitution of the minor beneficiary. Jamal is sitting at the very top of the federal recovery list. The court-appointed liquidators are currently selling off the luxury penthouse, the expensive sports cars, and the remaining hollow corporate holdings. The entire $200,000 will be completely restored to the trust by the end of this month." And Marcus the Y asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and calm, "He can never ever touch this secure account again." Patricia closed the thick folder, folding her hands neatly on top of the smooth leather desk pad. "I have completely restructured the entire trust agreement," she said, leaning forward to deliver the absolute guarantee. "I am now the mandatory secondary trustee. Any future withdrawal requires a dual, officially notarized signature from both of us and a direct verified phone call to the bank manager. Your son is sitting in a cold federal holding cell, currently denied all bail, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 long years. Even if he somehow walks out of a federal prison decades from now, he will never have the legal authority to withdraw a single solitary penny from his son. The money is locked down incredibly tight. Jamal is completely, absolutely safe." I looked out the large glass window, watching the busy, rushing Chicago traffic moving silently far below us. "What about Kendra?" I asked, turning my attention back to the grim reality of the violent daughter-in-law. Patricia sighed deeply, shaking her head in profound professional disgust. "She desperately tried to broker a federal plea deal," Patricia said, her voice dripping with well-earned contempt. "She offered to testify against her husband on all the corporate fraud charges, desperately hoping to completely escape the attempted murder indictment. But the federal prosecutor flatly refused the deal. They already have the hired driver, Darnell Vance, fully cooperating on the official record. They do not need Kendra, and they do not need her empty testimony. She is facing 25 years in a maximum security state facility. They are actively turning on each other from separate concrete cells, trying desperately to save themselves and failing completely." I finished my black coffee, setting the warm ceramic mug gently down on the polished wooden desk. The grand, deeply arrogant empire they tried to violently build on a foundation of cruel lies had completely collapsed into worthless dust. They had aggressively tried to break a 72-year-old watchmaker, assuming my quiet nature was a clear sign of total weakness. They never understood the absolute unyielding strength it takes to sit perfectly still and watch the tiny hidden gears of the world slowly turn. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, shaking the firm, capable hand of my new attorney. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, feeling a deep, profound weight lift completely off my tired, aching shoulders. "You do excellent, incredibly precise work." Patricia offered a small, genuinely warm smile. "You gave us the perfect, undeniable blueprints, Isaiah," she replied, closing the final file. "All I had to do was strictly follow the brilliant lines you drew." I walked out of the towering, imposing legal building, stepping out into the freezing, bracing air of the Chicago winter. The cold, sharp wind felt incredibly good against my face, waking up my senses, reminding me that I was fully alive. I walked toward the elevated train station, my steps completely steady and entirely unhurried. I was not a frail, confused old man, trembling terribly at the dark shadows in his own home. I was a proud master craftsman, a resilient man who had successfully repaired the most dangerous broken mechanism of his entire long life. The toxic, corrupted parts had been permanently removed from the machine. The rusted, failing springs had been entirely discarded. The deep foundation of my family was finally beautifully clean. I walked up the metal stairs to the train platform, listening to the rhythmic, soothing clatter of the heavy steel wheels against the iron tracks. I had a wonderful, quiet shop to open, and I had a brilliant grandson waiting for me. The month of April brought a gentle, sweeping warmth to the city of Chicago. The harsh, bitter freeze of the winter finally broke, washing the heavy gray salt from the busy streets and leaving everything feeling completely new. "You thought you were so much smarter than the old watchmaker. You thought my silence was weakness and my patience was senility." I walked around the table, standing right in front of my trembling son and his sobbing wife. I looked at the cold, untouched holiday food, the fraudulent legal papers, the wire traces, the audio bug, and the signed murder confession all scattered across the beautiful mahogany wood. "But a watchmaker knows exactly how to build a cage out of time," I said, looking down at them with absolute, undeniable finality. "And your time is officially up." I stood over them in the dining room, looking at the absolute ruin they had made of their own lives. Marcus was staring at the floor, his broad shoulders hunched forward, looking exactly like a hollow, empty shell of a man. Kendra was still sobbing quietly against the wall. Her expensive makeup ruined her designer clothes, crumpled on the hardwood floor. They had walked into my house thinking they were the apex predators, the absolute masters of the universe, ready to put a pin in the hand of a broken old man. Now they were just two terrified criminals, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of their own greed. I smiled back, feeling a deep, powerful warmth bloom right in the center of my chest. "You certainly did, son," I replied, walking over to inspect his incredibly careful work. "You have the absolute gift for this trade. You respect the time it takes to do things right." Jamal looked down at the tiny ticking mechanism in his hands. He was a completely different boy now. The terrible, heavy anxiety his father had forced upon him was entirely gone. He knew his trust fund was completely secure, locked safely away in a pristine bank account. He knew he lived in a safe, quiet home with a grandfather who would absolutely tear down the world to protect him. He was finally allowed to just be a child learning a beautiful ancient craft with nothing but a bright open road ahead of him. I walked back to my own large workbench, sitting down in my comfortable leather chair. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer, pulling out a small, faded velvet box. "You cannot give back what is already gone, Marcus," I told him, my tone completely devoid of any remaining warmth. You cannot just void the absolute terror you put your wife through, forcing her into a desperate corner. You cannot just unforge a federal document, and you certainly cannot refund the pure absolute betrayal you inflicted on a 10-year-old boy. Jamal sat right here in this house today, peeling carrots in my kitchen, knowing his own father was coming here to steal from his grandfather. He felt the coldness in your heart long before I ever saw the paperwork. But sitting in my beautiful new shop, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my grandson, working peacefully in the corner, I finally understood everything Elijah had meant. Time is not just something you measure on a dial. Time is the quiet, unbreakable resilience you build while you survive the terrible storms. Time is the patience it takes to watch the toxic, broken people destroy themselves while you keep your own hands completely steady and clean. I picked up the delicate gold timepiece, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of it in my palm. I took my fine steel tools, and I slowly, meticulously opened the back casing. The tiny, complicated gears caught the bright morning sun shining with brilliant, absolute clarity. I found the broken mainspring pulling the shattered, useless metal out of the chassis. I reached into my drawer, selecting a brand new, perfectly coiled spring, and I carefully, precisely set it right into the empty heart of the watch. I tightened the tiny golden screws. I applied a microscopic drop of specialized oil to the friction points, and then I reached up and I slowly turned the winding crown. The heavy gold watch came completely beautifully alive. The tiny balance wheel started to swing with a rapid, flawless rhythm. The brilliant ticking sound filled the quiet shop, beating like a strong, completely healthy heart. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable victory. I held the ticking masterpiece up to the light, letting the sun reflect off the polished gold. I had spent my entire life fixing broken things, but this was not a repair. This was a complete, profound resurrection. I had survived the worst, most vicious betrayal a father could ever face, and I had not let it turn my heart cold. I had saved my business, I had saved my family legacy, and most importantly, I had saved the precious, beautiful life of my grandson. Jamal walked over to my bench, wiping his hands on his canvas apron, finally realizing that his expensive corporate tongue could not talk his way out of this room. "I love you, Marcus," I said quietly, speaking the final honest truth of a heartbroken father. "But I will never, ever let you hurt this family again." I reached out my right hand, my fingers brushing against the cold brass wall plate, and with a single absolute motion I flicked the porch light switch. The click of the light switch was a small sound, but it echoed down the hallway with the force of a falling anvil. I stood perfectly still with my hand resting near the brass plate, and I watched the front door. The wait was not long. It took exactly 4 seconds for the darkness outside to explode into blinding, chaotic red and blue light. The heavy oak door did not just open, it was violently breached, swinging inward so hard the brass knob punched a deep hole directly into the plaster wall. Federal agents poured into the foyer, moving with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. There were at least a dozen of them wearing dark tactical gear, the heavy letters of the Bureau stenciled across their reinforced vests. The howling Chicago blizzard rushed in behind them, blowing thick white snow across the polished hardwood floors, instantly ruining the pristine, expensive aesthetic my son cared so much about. Federal agents, a loud, commanding voice shouted over the wind. Nobody move a single muscle. Special Agent Miller stepped through the threshold, his dark overcoat dusted with fresh snow. He did not look like a man arriving at a holiday dinner. He looked like the absolute embodiment of inevitable, crushing justice. He walked past me with a curt professional nod, leading his tactical team straight down the hallway and directly into the dining room. Marcus had stood up from his chair, his hands raised in the air, his face completely drained of blood. He looked at the armed agents flooding his childhood home, and his fake corporate bravado made one final, pathetic attempt to save him. "You cannot do this," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking wildly in the sudden chaos. I am a senior corporate partner. I demand to speak to my legal counsel immediately. This is an illegal entry." Agent Miller did not slow down, and he certainly did not care about my son and his corporate title. Miller stepped right up to Marcus, grabbed the lapels of his $3,000 cashmere suit, and forcefully spun him around. Marcus slammed face first against the beautiful mahogany dining table, his cheek pressing directly onto the space where his fraudulent forged mortgage documents had been sitting just moments before. "Marcus Vance." Agent Miller announced, his voice a flat, uncompromising hammer. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, and the embezzlement of a minor trust." The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around the wrists of my son, the loud metallic clicks sounding exactly like a prison cell slamming completely shut. Marcus thrashed wildly against the wood, his expensive shoes slipping on the floor, but the federal agents held him down with effortless, absolute control. Dad Marcus sobbed, turning his head sideways against the table, his tears soaking right into the linen tablecloth. "Dad, please tell them to stop. You cannot let them take me in handcuffs. I am your son." I stood in the doorway of the dining room, my hands resting quietly at my sides. I did not move forward, and I did not flinch. "You are not my son right now, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the raid. "Right now, you are just a thief who finally ran out of time." On the other side of the room, Kendra was completely hysterical. She tried to crawl backward away from the tactical boots surrounding her, screaming at the top of her lungs, dragging her expensive designer dress across the floor. "I am the victim here," Kendra wailed, kicking her legs wildly, her face a smeared, ruined mask of expensive makeup and pure terror. "He forced me to do it. He controlled the money. I did not want to hurt the old man." A female federal agent stepped forward, completely ignoring the desperate performance. She hauled Kendra up from the floor by the arms of her designer sweater, spinning her around and locking a pair of heavy steel cuffs onto her wrists. "Kendra Vance," the agent said, speaking directly into her ear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder in the first degree." Kendra let out a horrifying, ear-piercing shriek, finally understanding that her wealthy elite privilege could not buy her way out of a murder charge. She collapsed into dead weight, forcing two federal agents to physically drag her out of the dining room, her expensive heels scraping uselessly across the floor. She screamed my name over and over again as they pulled her down the hallway, but I did not look at her. Agent Miller turned his attention to the dining table. He looked at the roasted turkey, the cold potatoes, and the absolute mountain of damning evidence Tyrone had neatly arranged. He looked at the clear plastic evidence bag holding the audio bug and the thick folder containing the sworn murder confession. "Secure everything on this table," Miller ordered, waving his tactical team forward. "Bag the electronics log, the county recorder files, and get those wire traces into the evidence lockbox. This entire room is an active federal crime scene." The agents moved quickly, sweeping up the fake ruined empire Marcus had tried to build. They took his fraudulent transfer agreement. They took his expensive gold pen, and they took the absolute undeniable proof of his stolen trust fund. Everything he valued, everything he used to hurt this family was bagged, tagged, and carried out into the freezing night. Tyrone Washington stood quietly in the corner of the room, his heavy canvas coat blending into the shadows. He watched the agents dismantle the predators with a grim, deeply satisfied expression. He caught my eye, offering a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging that the massive, complex mechanism we had built had executed its final turn with flawless, devastating precision. They pulled Marcus up from the table, dragging him forcefully toward the front door. He looked absolutely pathetic, a broken, defeated shell of a corporate liquidator, his tailored suit wrinkled and covered in the dust of his own shattered lies. He looked at me one last time as they dragged him past the foyer, his eyes searching for any remaining scrap of pity. He found absolutely nothing. The heavy oak door closed behind them, cutting off the howling wind and plunging the house back into a deep, sudden silence. The flashing red and blue lights painted the front windows, slowly fading away as the federal convoy drove out of my neighborhood, carrying my son to a concrete cell he would not leave for a very long time. I walked slowly back into the dining room, looking at the empty chairs and the quiet destruction left behind by the raid. The white tablecloth was stained with spilled wine, and the chairs were pushed back at sharp, chaotic angles. I reached down, picking up a single silver fork from the floor and placed it neatly back onto the table. There is a profound, deep peace that comes when a massive lie is finally dragged out into the light and completely destroyed. I walked to the bottom of the staircase, looking up into the dark hallway of the second floor. Jamal was up there, safe from the storm. The absolute worst of the winter wind had finally passed, and the roof had held firm against the pressure. I placed my hand on the wooden banister, taking a deep, clean breath for the first time in 6 months. The trap was empty, and the house belonged entirely to me again. The month of February arrived with a cold, clear sky over Chicago. The violent, chaotic blizzard from Christmas Eve was entirely gone. The heavy snow had melted away from the sidewalks, leaving the city sharp, bright, and completely awake. My house was deeply quiet, but it was a vastly different kind of quiet. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of a hidden trap waiting to spring. It was the peaceful, breathing quiet of a strong structure that had successfully survived a massive storm. Jamal was at his middle school. He was doing very well. The dark, heavy shadows of anxiety had finally lifted from his young eyes, replaced by the bright, curious spark that belonged to a 10-year-old boy. My new attorney was a highly competent woman named Patricia Wren. She did not wear flashy, expensive suits, and she did not smile unless there was a genuinely good reason to do so. She operated out of a quiet, deeply respectable office in the heart of the Loop. I sat across from her heavy mahogany desk on a crisp Tuesday morning. The bright winter sun cut through her large window, illuminating the thick, highly organized stacks of legal files resting on her desk. She poured me a hot cup of black coffee and she opened the master file. "We need to officially void the fraudulent commercial lien first," Patricia said, tapping her pen firmly against the Cook County seal. "The federal indictment against your son makes this a very straightforward process. We have the absolute forensic evidence, the undeniable forged signature analysis, and the sworn confession of the corrupt notary." Desmond Hayes flipped the very moment they put him in a federal interrogation room. He surrendered his entire law license, and he gave the federal prosecution everything they needed to completely dismantle the illegal mortgage. I took a slow, warming sip of the hot coffee. "The vintage watch shop belongs entirely to me again?" I asked, needing to hear the absolute confirmation. Patricia nodded once, a firm, unyielding gesture. "The property deed is completely clear," she said, her voice carrying absolute professional certainty. "The bank recognized the massive systemic fraud, and they voided the commercial debt entirely. You owe them absolutely nothing, Isaiah. Your business is completely safe." We moved on to the second legal file on her desk. This was the specific folder that mattered the absolute most to me. The irrevocable trust fund set up for Jamal. The sacred money Marcus had systematically drained, trying to steal a bright future right from his own blood. Patricia opened the heavy ledger, running her finger down the long column of numbers. "The federal prosecutors have successfully frozen all of your son and his remaining corporate assets," Patricia explained, pointing to a long, detailed list of seized bank accounts. "Because the stolen trust money was funneled directly into those failing equity shells, the government is strictly prioritizing the financial restitution of the minor beneficiary. Jamal is sitting at the very top of the federal recovery list. The court-appointed liquidators are currently selling off the luxury penthouse, the expensive sports cars, and the remaining hollow corporate holdings. The entire $200,000 will be completely restored to the trust by the end of this month. And Marcus, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady and calm. He can never ever touch this secure account again. Patricia closed the thick folder, folding her hands neatly on top of the smooth leather desk pad. I have completely restructured the entire trust agreement, she said, leaning forward to deliver the absolute guarantee. I am now the mandatory secondary trustee. Any future withdrawal requires a dual, officially notarized signature from both of us and a direct, verified phone call to the bank manager. Your son is sitting in a cold federal holding cell, currently denied all bail, facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 long years. Even if he somehow walks out of a federal prison decades from now, he will never have the legal authority to withdraw a single solitary penny from his son. The money is locked down incredibly tight. Jamal is completely, absolutely safe. I looked out the large glass window, watching the busy, rushing Chicago traffic moving silently far below us. What about Kendra? I asked, turning my attention back to the grim reality of the violent daughter-in-law. Patricia sighed deeply, shaking her head in profound professional disgust. She desperately tried to broker a federal plea deal, Patricia said, her voice dripping with well-earned contempt. She offered to testify against her husband on all the corporate fraud charges, desperately hoping to completely escape the attempted murder indictment. But the federal prosecutor flatly refused the deal. They already have the hired driver, Darnell Vance, fully cooperating on the official record. They do not need Kendra, and they do not need her empty testimony. She is facing 25 years in a maximum security state facility. They are actively turning on each other from separate concrete cells, trying desperately to save themselves and failing completely. I finished my black coffee, setting the warm ceramic mug gently down on the polished wooden desk. The grand, deeply arrogant empire they tried to violently build on a foundation of cruel lies had completely collapsed into worthless dust. They had aggressively tried to break a 72-year-old watchmaker, assuming my quiet nature was a clear sign of total weakness. They never understood the absolute unyielding strength it takes to sit perfectly still and watch the tiny hidden gears of the world slowly turn. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, shaking the firm, capable hand of my new attorney. "Thank you, Patricia," I said, feeling a deep, profound weight lift completely off my tired, aching shoulders. "You do excellent, incredibly precise work." Patricia offered a small, genuinely warm smile. "You gave us the perfect, undeniable blueprints, Isaiah," she replied, closing the final file. "All I had to do was strictly follow the brilliant lines you drew." I walked out of the towering, imposing legal building, stepping out into the freezing, bracing air of the Chicago winter. The cold, sharp wind felt incredibly good against my face, waking up my senses, reminding me that I was fully alive. I walked toward the elevated train station, my steps completely steady and entirely unhurried. I was not a frail, confused old man, trembling terribly at the dark shadows in his own home. I was a proud master craftsman, a resilient man who had successfully repaired the most dangerous broken mechanism of his entire long life. The toxic, corrupted parts had been permanently removed from the machine. The rusted, failing springs had been entirely discarded. The deep foundation of my family was finally beautifully clean. I walked up the metal stairs to the train platform, listening to the rhythmic, soothing clatter of the heavy steel wheels against the iron tracks. I had a wonderful, quiet shop to open, and I had a brilliant grandson waiting for me. The month of April brought a gentle, sweeping warmth to the city of Chicago. The harsh, bitter freeze of the winter finally broke, washing the heavy gray salt from the busy streets and leaving everything feeling completely new. I did not return to the old drafty shop in the dark alleyway. That place held too many cold memories and too many dark shadows. Instead, I opened a brand new, beautifully bright space on a busy, safe corner in the South Loop. The large, pristine glass windows, let the brilliant morning sun pour directly over the polished wooden floorboards. I painted the walls a warm, inviting cream color, and I bought 3 brand new, heavy oak display cases. The air inside smelled wonderfully of fresh lemon oil, warm brass, and absolute undeniable freedom. I stood behind the main counter, looking across the quiet, peaceful room. I was not alone. In the far corner, bathed in the bright morning light, sat a small, perfectly constructed wooden workbench. It was not a place for middle school math homework anymore. Jamal sat at that bench wearing a thick, durable canvas apron over his fresh clothes. He held a small, specialized magnifying loupe to his right eye, his small hands resting steadily on the leather pad. He was holding a pair of fine steel tweezers, carefully setting a tiny, delicate gear into the brass chassis of a vintage pocket watch. He did not flinch, and he did not shake. He had the exact same absolute stillness in his hands that his grandfather had. "You are pressing a little too hard on the bridge, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low and entirely encouraging. "Let the tiny screws do the actual work. You just guide them into place." Jamal paused, taking a slow, calm breath. He loosened his grip on the tweezers, adjusting his angle slightly, and gently set the piece perfectly into the alignment. It clicked with a soft, satisfying snap. He looked up at me, taking the magnifying loupe away from his eye, and offered a huge, genuinely brilliant smile. "I got it," Grandpa Jamal said, his voice ringing with pure, unadulterated pride. "It fits completely flush." I smiled back, feeling a deep, powerful warmth bloom right in the center of my chest. "You certainly did, son," I replied, walking over to inspect his incredibly careful work. "You have the absolute gift for this trade. You respect the time it takes to do things right." Jamal looked down at the tiny, ticking mechanism in his hands. He was a completely different boy now. The terrible, heavy anxiety his father had forced upon him was entirely gone. He knew his trust fund was completely secure, locked safely away in a pristine bank account. He knew he lived in a safe, quiet home with a grandfather who would absolutely tear down the world to protect him. He was finally allowed to just be a child learning a beautiful, ancient craft with nothing but a bright open road ahead of him. I walked back to my own large workbench, sitting down in my comfortable leather chair. I unlocked the heavy bottom drawer, pulling out a small faded velvet box. I set it gently on the glass counter, popping the delicate brass clasp open. Resting inside on the dark fabric was a heavy, incredibly intricate gold timepiece. It did not have a name brand stamped on the dial. It was a custom absolute masterpiece built entirely by hand. My old mentor, Elijah Washington, had given me this broken watch exactly 40 years ago, right before he passed away. He told me it was his finest, most complicated work, but the mainspring had shattered and the intricate gear train was completely seized. He told me to fix it only when I truly understood the absolute value of unbroken time. For 4 decades, I kept it locked in the dark safe. I never felt wise enough or settled enough to open the delicate gold casing. I always felt like I was rushing, like I was missing some crucial hidden lesson. But sitting in my beautiful new shop, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my grandson working peacefully in the corner, I finally understood everything Elijah had meant. Time is not just something you measure on a dial. Time is the quiet, unbreakable resilience you build while you survive the terrible storms. Time is the patience it takes to watch the toxic, broken people destroy themselves while you keep your own hands completely steady and clean. I picked up the delicate gold timepiece, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of it in my palm. I took my fine steel tools, and I slowly, meticulously opened the back casing. The tiny, complicated gears caught the bright morning sun shining with brilliant, absolute clarity. I found the broken mainspring pulling the shattered, useless metal out of the chassis. I reached into my drawer, selecting a brand new, perfectly coiled spring, and I carefully, precisely set it right into the empty heart of the watch. I tightened the tiny golden screws. I applied a microscopic drop of specialized oil to the friction points, and then I reached up and I slowly turned the winding crown. The heavy gold watch came completely beautifully alive. The tiny balance wheel started to swing with a rapid, flawless rhythm. The brilliant ticking sound filled the quiet shop, beating like a strong, completely healthy heart. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable victory. I held the ticking masterpiece up to the light, letting the sun reflect off the polished gold. I'd spent my entire life fixing broken things, but this was not a repair. This was a complete, profound resurrection. I had survived the worst, most vicious betrayal a father could ever face, and I had not let it turn my heart cold. I had saved my business, I had saved my family legacy, and most importantly, I had saved the precious, beautiful life of my grandson. Jamal walked over to my bench, wiping his hands on his canvas apron. He looked at the shining gold watch, his eyes wide with genuine, absolute wonder. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Grandpa Jamal whispered, listening intently to the rapid, flawless ticking. "Did you finally fix it?" I looked at the bright, incredibly hopeful face of the boy, who would one day inherit every single thing I had built. I placed the heavy gold watch gently into his small, steady hands. "Yes, Jamal," I said, my voice filled with complete, absolute peace. "We finally fixed everything. Greed always blinds the foolish to the quiet strength of the patient. True wealth is not found in forged signatures or stolen trusts, but in the unwavering resilience of a mind that watches, waits, and strikes when the light is perfect. Blood may betray you, but undeniable justice never ever will."